Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never really believed in this stuff before. Hell, I used to laugh at those grainy videos and stories people would tell around campfires. But what happened to me and my wife Tanya on that gravel road in Yakima County changed everything. I'm still trying to make sense of it all, and honestly, part of me wishes I could just forget the whole damn thing. It was late October, maybe around 9:30 at night, and we were driving back from visiting some friends who lived way out in the sticks. You know how those back roads are in Washington. Nothing but thick forest on both sides, gravel crunching under your tires, and darkness so complete it feels like it's pressing against your windows. Tanya was dozing in the passenger seat, and I was just focused on getting us home without hitting a deer or ending up in a ditch. That's when our headlights caught them. Two guys walking along the side of the road. Young guys, maybe early 20s, and they looked like they'd been through hell. Their clothes were dirty. They were stumbling a bit, and when I slowed down, I could see the exhaustion written all over their faces. Out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night, something was definitely wrong. I rolled down my window. "You guys okay? Need a ride?" The relief that washed over their faces was immediate and intense, like they'd been praying for exactly this moment. The taller one, he stepped closer to the truck, and I could see his hands were shaking. "Oh man, thank God," he said, his voice cracking a little. "Our Jeep broke down about 5 miles back. The rear axle just snapped in half. We've been walking for hours." Tanya was awake now, leaning forward to get a better look at them. "Get in," she said without hesitation. "You must be freezing." As they climbed into the back of our truck, I noticed they kept looking over their shoulders at the tree line. Not just casual glances. They were genuinely spooked by something. The shorter one had this 3-battery flashlight clutched in his hands like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Thanks for stopping," the taller one said as we started driving again. "Most people probably wouldn't pick up strangers out here." "No problem," I said. "What happened with your Jeep?" That's when things got weird. The shorter guy, who hadn't said much yet, suddenly spoke up. His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was real fear in it. "Something was following us," he said. Tanya turned around in her seat. "Following you? Like another car?" "No," the taller one said, and I could hear him swallow hard. "Through the trees, alongside the road. We could hear it the whole time we were walking." I glanced at them in the rearview mirror. These weren't kids trying to scare us or make up some story for attention. They looked genuinely terrified, the kind of fear you can't fake, the kind that gets into your bones and stays there. "What kind of sounds?" Tanya asked. "Growling," the shorter one said, gripping his flashlight tighter. "And branches breaking. Heavy footsteps. It stayed just out of sight, but we could hear it keeping pace with us. Every time we stopped, it stopped. When we started walking faster, it moved faster too." The hair on the back of my neck started standing up. I've lived in Washington my whole life, spent countless hours hunting and camping in these forests. I know the sounds animals make, and what these guys were describing didn't match anything I could think of. Bears don't follow people for miles. Cougars are silent when they stalk. And no human would be out there in the dark, paralleling a road through thick forest. "How long was it following you?" I asked. "The whole time," the taller one said. "From the moment we left our Jeep." "Maybe 3 hours. We tried shining the flashlight into the trees a few times, but we never saw anything, just heard it moving around out there." Tanya was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did you see your Jeep break down, or did you hear something that made you stop first?" They looked at each other, and I saw something pass between them, like they were deciding whether to tell us something. We heard the growling before the axle broke, the shorter one admitted. We were driving slow because of the rough road, and this sound started coming from the forest. Deep, angry growling. That's when we stopped to listen, and when we tried to start driving again, the axle snapped. A chill ran down my spine. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidence, like something had wanted them out of that vehicle, walking and vulnerable. "Did either of you get a look at whatever it was?" Tanya asked. "Once," the taller one said, "when we first started walking. I thought I saw something big moving between the trees, keeping pace with us. Bigger than any person should be, and the way it moved, it wasn't quite right. Not like a bear or anything else I've ever seen." We drove in silence for a few minutes after that. The only sounds were the gravel under our tires and the hum of the engine. But now I found myself checking the mirrors more often, scanning the tree line whenever our headlights swept across it. The darkness seemed thicker somehow, more oppressive. "You guys from around here?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Yeah, we live over in Toppenish," the taller one said. "Actually, our little brothers go to school with your kids, I think." "The Hendersons. Tommy and Jake Henderson?" Tanya perked up. "Oh, you're the Henderson boys. I should have recognized you. Your mom works at the bank, right?" That small connection somehow made everything feel a little less scary. These weren't random strangers with a wild story. They were local kids whose family we knew. That made their fear seem even more real, more credible. "Yeah, that's us," the shorter one said, and for the first time since we'd picked them up, he seemed to relax a tiny bit. "Mom's gonna kill us for being out this late. We were supposed to be back hours ago." "She'll just be glad you're safe," Tanya said. "Do you want us to call her when we get to town?" As we approached the main highway, I could feel the tension in the truck starting to ease. The headlights of other cars, the glow of distant streetlights, the familiar landmarks of civilization. It all helped push away the oppressive feeling that had settled over us on that dark gravel road. But just before we reached the intersection, the taller Henderson boy spoke up again. "Thanks for believing us," he said quietly. "Most adults would have just written it off as our imagination or something. But what we heard out there, it wasn't normal. It wasn't any animal I've ever encountered." I pulled up to the stop sign and looked at them in the mirror. "What do you think it was?" They exchanged another look, and the shorter one shrugged. "Honestly, I don't know, but it was big, really big and intelligent, like it was toying with us, you know? Letting us know it was there, but staying just out of sight. After we dropped them off at the gas station where their mum was waiting, apparently she'd been driving around, looking for them for the past hour. Tanya and I didn't talk much on the drive home. We were both processing what we'd heard, trying to make sense of it." "Do you believe them?" Tanya asked as we pulled into our driveway. I thought about it for a moment. "Yeah, I do. They were too scared for it to be made up. And the details, they were too specific, too consistent." "So, what do you think was following them?" I didn't have an answer for that. Still don't really. But as we walked from our truck to our front door that night, I found myself looking over my shoulder at the forest that bordered our property. The same forest that stretched for miles in every direction, connecting to the wilderness where those boys had been walking. For the first time in my life, those familiar trees looked different to me. Less like peaceful woodland, and more like a place where something large and unknown could be watching, waiting, staying just out of sight. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear the fear in those boys' voices again, describing the sounds that had followed them for miles through the darkness. The heavy footsteps, the growling, the intelligence behind it all. The next morning I called in sick to work. I told Tanya I wanted to take a walk down that same gravel road just to see if we could find any sign of what had terrorized the Henderson boys. She thought I was crazy, but she came with me anyway. Said she was curious too. We parked at the intersection and started walking down the gravel road. It was completely different in the daylight, just a normal forest road, the kind I'd walked down hundreds of times before. Birds were singing, squirrels were chattering in the trees. Everything seemed peaceful and ordinary. But about half a mile in, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, clear as day in the soft dirt beside the road, were tracks. Not human tracks, not bear tracks, something else entirely. The footprints were enormous, easily 18 inches long and maybe 7 inches wide. They showed clear toe impressions, 5 toes like a human, but the proportions were all wrong. Too long, too wide, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. Jesus Christ, Tanya whispered, kneeling down beside one of the clearest prints. What the hell made these? I counted at least a dozen tracks, following the road for maybe 50 feet before disappearing into the forest. They were deep impressions, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy, and the stride length between prints was enormous, at least 4 feet, maybe more. We took pictures with our phone, using Tanya's hand for scale comparison. Even through the camera lens, the size difference was shocking. These weren't made by any animal I could identify. But the thing that really got to me was the timing. These tracks were fresh. You could tell by how clean the edges were, how deep they'd pressed into the soft earth. And they were right where the Henderson boys said they'd been followed. We need to show these to someone, Tanya said. Who? The police? And tell them what? That we found some weird footprints in the woods. She was quiet for a moment, studying the tracks. What if those boys were right? What if something really was following them? The thought sent a chill through me, because looking at those massive footprints, remembering the genuine terror in those young men's voices, it all started to add up to something I wasn't ready to accept. We spent another hour out there looking for more evidence. We found broken branches about 8 feet off the ground, snapped clean, like something incredibly strong had pushed through the forest without bothering to go around obstacles. We found more partial footprints in softer areas. And in one spot, we found what looked like a daybed, a large area where something had been resting, with grass and small branches pressed down in the rough shape of a massive body. As we were preparing to leave, we heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold and sent every survival instinct I had into overdrive. It was a call of some kind, deep, powerful, and unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, something in between, but with a quality that sounded almost intelligent, like language I couldn't understand. The call came from deeper in the forest, maybe a quarter mile away. It lasted about 10 seconds, echoing off the trees and seeming to come from everywhere at once. Then silence. Tanya grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. We need to go, right now. I didn't argue. We walked back to our truck as quickly as we could without running, constantly looking over our shoulders. That call had felt like a warning, like we were being told to leave, and every instinct I had was screaming that we should listen. We never went back to that road. A few weeks later, I heard that the Henderson boys' Jeep had been found, but it was in much worse condition than they'd described. Not just a broken axle, the entire vehicle had been torn apart. Windows smashed, doors ripped off their hinges, the roof caved in, like something incredibly strong had taken out its frustration on the abandoned vehicle. The official explanation was that vandals had found it and destroyed it. But I knew better. I'd seen those footprints, I'd heard that call in the forest. Whatever had followed those boys through the darkness wasn't human. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't want to be found, but wasn't afraid to let people know it was there. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm driving alone on dark forest roads. I think about the terror in those young men's voices, the massive footprints we found, and that inhuman call echoing through the trees. Most of all, I think about how many other people might have had similar encounters, but never reported them. How many drivers have picked up stranded travelers with impossible stories? How many hikers have found inexplicable tracks? How many hunters have heard sounds in the forest that defied explanation? I used to be a skeptic, used to think all this Bigfoot stuff was just stories and hoaxes, but not anymore. Now I know there's something out there in the deep woods of Washington, something that watches from the shadows and follows people through the darkness, something that wants us to know it exists but isn't ready to show itself completely. And honestly, after what I experienced, I think that's probably for the best. Story 2. I'm still shaking as I write this. What happened this morning has completely turned my world upside down, and I don't think I'll ever look at those woods the same way again. Hell, I don't think I'll ever feel safe walking down any forest road after what me and Tanya discovered. You have to understand, I've always been the practical type. I work with my hands, fix things that are broken, deal with problems head on. But this morning proved there are some things in this world that just can't be explained away or fixed with common sense. Some things that make you question everything you thought you knew about what's possible. It all started because we helped those Henderson boys the night before. You know, the 2 young guys we picked up walking down that gravel road in Yakima County after their Jeep broke down. They were terrified, kept talking about something following them through the forest for hours. At the time, I believed them. You could see the genuine fear in their eyes, but part of me still wondered if maybe they'd just spooked themselves in the dark. Well, I'm not wondering anymore. Tanya barely slept that night. She kept tossing and turning, asking me what I thought was really out there in those woods. Around 6 in the morning, she finally gave up trying to sleep and shook me awake. I can't stop thinking about those boys, she said. What if something really was following them? I was still groggy, but I could see she was genuinely worried. What do you want to do about it? Let's go back, she said, in the daylight. We're supposed to meet Scott out there anyway for that hunting spot survey. We could walk that road, maybe find some evidence of what scared them so bad. Scott's our buddy who knows every inch of these forests. He'd been wanting to show us a potential hunting area, and we'd agreed to meet him around 8:30 that morning. The timing seemed perfect. We could check out the road where we'd picked up the Henderson boys and then meet up with Scott. I have to admit, I was curious too. Those boys had been genuinely terrified, and their story was so specific, so detailed. If something had really been stalking them through miles of forest, there had to be some kind of evidence left behind. So we got dressed, grabbed some coffee, and drove back out to that same gravel road. In the morning light, everything looked completely different. Peaceful even, birds singing, sunlight filtering through the trees, the kind of beautiful Washington forest morning that makes you grateful to live here. We parked where the gravel road branched off from the main highway and started walking. Tanya had her camera with her. She's always taking pictures of our outdoor adventures. And I brought a measuring tape, just in case we found anything worth documenting. It's hard to believe those boys were so scared walking down this same road, Tanya said, as we crunched along on the gravel. It seems so normal. Darkness changes everything, I said. What looks friendly in daylight can seem threatening at night. We'd walked maybe half a mile when I saw them. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was like my eyes were showing me something that didn't make sense, something that shouldn't exist. Tanya, I said, my voice coming out weird and strangled. Stop, right now. She was a few steps ahead of me, and when she turned around, she saw the expression on my face. What's wrong? I pointed at the road surface just ahead of her. Look down. Look at the ground. That's when she saw them too. Footprints, massive, clear footprints pressed deep into the softer dirt at the edge of the gravel road. But these weren't human footprints, and they sure as hell weren't from any animal I'd ever seen. Oh my God, Tanya whispered, and I could hear the excitement and fear mixing in her voice. Are those... I don't know what they are. I said. But that was a lie. Deep down, I knew exactly what we were looking at. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. The footprints were enormous, easily 18 inches long, maybe more. They had 5 toes like a human foot, but the proportions were all wrong. Too wide, too deep, with clear impressions of what looked like thick, leathery skin. And the size of them, Jesus, the size of them. Whatever made these tracks had to be massive. But here's the thing that really got to me, the detail that made my hands start shaking. These prints were right on top of our tire tracks from the night before. I could see where our truck had driven over the soft shoulder of the road, and these footprints were pressed right into those same tire marks. Fresh, recent, like whatever made them had walked this road after we'd driven down it. "Tanya, get your camera," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to document this." She was already pulling it out, her hands trembling slightly. "I can't believe I'm seeing this. I mean, I've heard stories my whole life, but seeing actual footprints." I knelt down next to the clearest print and pulled out the measuring tape, 18.5 inches long, 7 inches wide at the broadest point. The impression was deep, at least 2 inches into the packed earth. Whatever made this track was incredibly heavy. "Put your hand next to it," I told Tanya, "for scale." She knelt down and placed her hand beside the massive footprint. The contrast was shocking. Her whole hand, from wrist to fingertips, was shorter than just the toes of this print. When she took the picture, we both just stared at the camera display in stunned silence. "There are more," Tanya said, standing up and looking down the road. "A whole line of them." She was right. Now that we knew what to look for, we could see the trail clearly. Massive footprints spaced about 4 feet apart, following the road for maybe 60 or 70 feet before disappearing into the forest on the other side. As we followed the trail, documenting each clear print, I started noticing other things. Broken branches at about 8 feet high, snapped clean like someone had pushed through without bothering to duck. Scraped bark on some of the larger trees, and in one spot, a clear handprint pressed into the soft bark of an alder tree. 5 fingers, but each one was as long as my entire hand. "This is incredible," Tanya said, but I could hear the nervousness creeping into her excitement. "Scott's going to flip when we show him these pictures." That's when we heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up and sent ice water through my veins. It came from deep in the forest, maybe a quarter-mile away. Low, powerful, and unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite a howl, wasn't quite a roar. More like a call of some kind, but with an intelligence behind it that no animal should have. It lasted maybe 8 or 10 seconds, echoing off the trees and seeming to vibrate through the ground under our feet. Tanya grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. What the hell was that? I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, right now. The sound came again, closer this time, much closer, and this time there was something different about it, something that sounded almost questioning, like whatever made that sound was aware of our presence and was trying to communicate. "We need to go," I said, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. "The cameras," Tanya said. "Scott wanted us to meet him here. He'll be here soon." Another call, even closer now. This one had a different tone entirely, more aggressive, like a warning. I grabbed Tanya's hand and started pulling her back toward our truck. "Scott can wait. We're leaving, now." But as we turned to head back, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There, in the soft dirt right where we'd been standing just minutes before, was a fresh footprint, a massive, clear impression that definitely hadn't been there when we arrived. "Tanya," I said, my voice shaking, "look behind us." She turned and saw the new print. For a moment, neither of us could speak. Then she said something that I still can't get out of my head. "It's been watching us this whole time." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever had made these tracks, whatever had been following the Henderson boys the night before, was still out there, still in the area, and it had been observing us as we documented its footprints, staying just out of sight in the thick forest. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran back to our truck like our lives depended on it, and maybe they did. The whole time, I could feel eyes on us, not human eyes. Something else, something that was deciding whether to reveal itself or let us go. When we reached the truck, I was fumbling with the keys so badly that Tanya had to take them from me and unlock the doors herself. We threw ourselves inside, and I started the engine with hands that were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. As we drove away, I checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see something massive step out of the tree line behind us, but the road stayed empty. Whatever was out there had decided to let us leave. We'd driven maybe 2 miles when we saw Scott's pickup approaching from the opposite direction. I pulled over and flagged him down. When he rolled down his window, I could see he was excited about something. "Perfect timing," he said. "You're not going to believe what I found this morning." Fresh Sasquatch tracks about a mile up that road, biggest ones I've ever seen. Tanya and I looked at each other. "We know," I said. "We found them too." Scott's eyes went wide when we showed him the pictures on Tanya's camera. He's been tracking and researching this stuff for years, and he said these were some of the clearest, most detailed footprints he'd ever seen documented. "The fact that they're right on top of your tire tracks," he said, studying the images. "That's significant. It means whatever made them walk this road after you drove it last night, recently, maybe just hours ago." We told him about the calls we'd heard, about the fresh print that had appeared while we were investigating. Scott got quiet when we described the sounds. "That's territorial behavior," he said finally. "It was letting you know it was there, warning you not to go any deeper into its area. You were smart to leave when you did." Over the next few weeks, Scott set up trail cameras in the area. He'd been wanting to get photographic evidence for years, and these tracks represented the best lead he'd ever had. We checked the cameras regularly, but whatever was out there seemed to know exactly where they were placed. We'd find the cameras moved, turned away from the trails, or sometimes just missing entirely. But we kept finding evidence. More tracks after heavy rains, trees with bark stripped off at impossible heights, rock formations that looked almost like territorial markers. And occasionally late at night, we'd hear those calls echoing through the forest, closer to town than they should be, closer to civilization than anything that large and unknown should venture. The Henderson boys never talked about their experience publicly, but word gets around in small communities. Soon, we were hearing similar stories from other people. Hunters who'd found oversized tracks, campers who'd been kept awake by sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal, drivers who'd glimpsed something large and bipedal crossing remote roads at night. It's like once we opened our eyes to the possibility, we started seeing evidence everywhere. Evidence that something lives in these deep woods. Something that's been here longer than our towns, longer than our roads, longer than our understanding of what's supposed to exist in the world. The pictures are still on Tanya's phone. The measurements are written in my notebook. The memory of those calls echoing through the forest is burned into my brain. But sometimes I wonder if we should have kept quiet about what we found. Because knowing something like that is out there, knowing it's been watching and following and making decisions about whether to reveal itself, changes you. I don't walk in the woods alone anymore. When I'm driving those back roads at night, I keep the windows up and the doors locked. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear something large moving through the forest behind our property. Footsteps too heavy and too measured to be anything that's supposed to exist. But the thing that really gets to me, the thing that keeps me awake some nights, is remembering how those fresh footprints appeared while we were standing right there. How something that massive managed to get close enough to leave tracks just yards away from where we were working without making a single sound. It makes you wonder what else might be out there, watching from the shadows, deciding when and if to make contact with our world. And honestly, after what I've seen and heard, I'm not sure I want to find out. Story 3. I've been bow hunting for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these Washington forests could throw at me. Bears, cougars, elk that could charge you down without warning. None of it fazed me anymore. But what happened to me in September of 2005 on Road 1502 changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in these woods. I still get the shakes thinking about it. Hell, I'm getting them right now just trying to write this down. But people need to know what's out there, what's really out there. It was early September, prime bow season, and I was scouting for a good camping spot. I'd been driving Road 1502 for maybe an hour, looking for somewhere remote enough that I wouldn't have to deal with other hunters, but close enough to water that the deer would come through regularly. You know how it is, finding that perfect balance between accessibility and isolation. The road was one of those typical Forest Service roads, mostly gravel with some rough patches where the winter runoff had washed out sections. Nothing my pickup couldn't handle, but rough enough that you had to take your time. I was driving maybe 20-25 miles per hour, windows down, enjoying the crisp September air and keeping my eyes open for any sign of game trails or water sources. That's when I saw it in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another hunter. You know how your brain works. It tries to make sense of what you're seeing by fitting it into something familiar. So when I glanced in the mirror and caught a glimpse of something tall and dark stepping onto the road behind me, my first thought was that someone else was out scouting the same area. But something felt wrong immediately. The movement was too fluid, too purposeful, and there was something about the proportions that didn't quite fit what a person should look like from that distance. I slowed down and tried to get a better look, but the dust cloud from my truck was obscuring everything behind me. These gravel roads kick up a hell of a lot of dust, especially when it's been dry like it had been that September. I couldn't see clearly through all that dust, but I could make out this dark figure just standing there in the middle of the road. That's when I realized I needed to find somewhere safe to pull over and figure out what I was looking at. Problem was, Road 1502 doesn't have a lot of wide spots. It's basically a single lane cut through thick forest with steep drop-offs on one side and dense trees on the other. There wasn't anywhere safe to stop and turn around. I kept driving slowly, checking my mirrors constantly. Every time I looked back, that figure was still there, still standing in the exact center of the road, not moving to one side or the other like a person would do when they saw a vehicle coming. Just standing there, waiting. The dust was starting to settle a bit, and that's when I got my first clear look at whatever was behind me. My blood went cold. This wasn't a person, not even close. The thing standing in my road was massive. I'd estimate 7 to 8 feet tall, but it wasn't just the height that was shocking. It was the width, the bulk. This thing was built like a linebacker, but scaled up to impossible proportions. Broad shoulders, thick chest, arms that hung down to about mid-thigh level, and it was covered in dark hair or fur, so dark it was almost black. I finally found a spot where the road widened slightly, just enough for me to pull over without sliding down the embankment. I stopped the truck and turned around in my seat to get a better look through the rear window. The creature was still there, maybe 50 yards behind me. It hadn't moved from the center of the road, but now I could see details that made my hands start shaking on the steering wheel. Its arms were hanging slightly away from its sides, and they were long, unnaturally long. They reached down past what would be the knee area on a human. The proportions were all wrong, like someone had taken a person and stretched them vertically while also bulking them up horizontally. The face was the worst part. Even through the dust and at that distance, I could make out features that looked almost human, but weren't quite right. The head was larger than it should be, and there was something about the way it was positioned on the shoulders that seemed wrong. Like the neck was too short or too thick. But what really got to me was the intelligence I could sense in its posture. This wasn't some confused animal that had wandered onto the road. This thing was studying me just as much as I was studying it. There was intention in the way it stood there, purpose in its stillness. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, engine running, trying to process what I was seeing. Part of my brain was still insisting this had to be a person in some kind of costume, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. That's when it moved. The creature seemed to pivot on its left leg, and I watched as it swung its arms in a coordinated motion while turning to face the left side of the road. The movement was smooth, controlled, almost graceful despite the thing's massive size. It took one deliberate step toward the left side of the road and then just disappeared into the forest. 1 second it was there, this huge, dark figure dominating the road behind me. The next second, nothing, like it had been swallowed by the trees. I sat there for another few minutes, engine idling, staring at the empty road. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. Finally, I worked up the courage to drive back to where the creature had been standing. I needed to see if there were any tracks, any evidence that what I'd witnessed was real and not just my imagination running wild. The road surface where it had been standing was too hard and gravelly to show clear footprints, but I could see scuff marks in the dust, disturbances in the gravel that suggested something heavy had been there. And where it had stepped off the road, I found a partial footprint in the softer dirt at the forest's edge. The print was huge, bigger than any human foot, with what looked like toe impressions pressed deep into the earth. I tried to measure it with my boot. My size 11 looked like a child's shoe next to that impression. But what really freaked me out was where the creature had gone. The left side of the road at that point was incredibly steep and rocky. I'm talking about a nearly vertical drop-off covered with loose shale and boulders. There was no way a normal person could have descended that slope without making a tremendous amount of noise, probably not without ropes and climbing gear. Yet this thing had stepped off the road and vanished down that impossible terrain without making a sound. In the complete silence that followed its disappearance, I should have heard rocks falling, branches breaking, something. But there was nothing, just the sound of my truck's engine and my own panicked breathing. I got back in my truck and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop to look for camping spots. I didn't check any of the side roads or game trails I'd been planning to explore. I just drove straight back to town with my windows up and my doors locked, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure nothing was following me. But the real kicker, the thing that still gives me nightmares, happened during my hunting trip later that week. I'd managed to convince myself that maybe I'd been seeing things, that the stress of work and the excitement of bow season had made me imagine the whole encounter. So I went ahead with my planned hunting trip, setting up camp about 10 miles from where I'd seen the creature. That entire week was wrong. Everything about it felt off from the moment I set foot in those woods. The forest was too quiet. The normal sounds you'd expect, birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing, were almost completely absent. It was like the whole ecosystem was holding its breath, and the deer were gone. In 20 years of hunting that area, I'd never failed to see at least 5 or 6 deer per day during bow season. These woods were usually thick with whitetails, especially during the early morning and late evening hours. But that week, I saw maybe 1 deer the entire time. 1 in 5 days of hunting. My hunting buddy mentioned it too when I called him on the radio. He was set up about 3 miles away and having the same experience. No deer, no elk, hardly any small game. It was like something had spooked every animal in a huge radius and driven them out of the area. On the 3rd night of my trip, I was lying in my sleeping bag when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling gait of a bear. These were measured, purposeful steps that sounded almost human, but not quite right. I grabbed my flashlight and my bow, but when I unzipped my tent and shined the light around, there was nothing there, just empty forest and shadows. But I could still hear the footsteps, just outside the range of my flashlight beam, circling, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in my tent with my bow nocked and ready, listening to those footsteps make their slow circuit around my camp. Sometimes they'd stop for long minutes, and I'd convince myself that whatever it was had moved on. Then I'd hear them again, closer this time, like whatever was out there was testing my defenses. When morning came, I found tracks, huge footprints in the soft earth around my campsite, forming a perfect circle maybe 30 yards from my tent. The prints were deep and clear, showing 5 toes and what looked like a broad, flat foot structure. Nothing like a bear's paw prints or a human's boot impressions. I packed up and left that morning. I told myself I was being practical, that bow season wasn't going to be productive in an area where all the game had been driven away. But the truth is, I was scared. More scared than I'd ever been in my life. The drive home was tense. I kept expecting to see that dark figure step onto the road ahead of me, to catch a glimpse of something massive moving through the trees alongside my truck. Every shadow looked threatening. Every bend in the road could be hiding something that shouldn't exist. I never went back to that area. I've hunted other parts of the forest since then, but I avoid Road 1502 and anything connecting to it. I tell people it's because the game population crashed there, which is true. But the real reason is that I know something lives in those woods, something that can move through impossible terrain without making a sound, something that can drive every other animal out of miles of forest just by being there. I've never told this story to anyone before. My wife knows something happened that spooked me during that hunting trip, but I've never given her the details. My hunting buddies think I just had bad luck with the deer that year, but the truth is, what I saw on Road 1502 wasn't bad luck. It was an encounter with something that's been living in these forests longer than we have, something that usually stays hidden, but sometimes decides to make its presence known. The thing that haunts me most is the intelligence I saw in that creature's movements, the way it studied me before deciding to disappear, the deliberate way it circled my campsite that night, like it was gathering information about this intruder in its territory. It could have hurt me, I'm certain of that. Something that size, that strong, could have torn through my tent and ended me before I could even reach for my bow. But it chose not to. It chose to watch, to intimidate, to make its point and then vanish. I don't know what that point was exactly. Maybe it was warning me to stay away. Maybe it was just curious about this human who'd wandered into its domain. But the message was clear. I was being allowed to leave, this time. I still boo hunt, but I'm more careful now about where I go and when. I stick to areas with more human activity, places where cell phones work and help isn't too far away. And I never hunt alone anymore. There's safety in numbers, even if those numbers wouldn't matter much if something that size decided we were unwelcome. Sometimes I wonder how many other hunters have had similar encounters and just never talked about them. How many people have seen something in these deep woods that made them question everything they thought they knew about what's possible? How many have felt those eyes watching from the shadows and known instinctively that they were in the presence of something ancient and powerful? All I know for sure is that there's something out there in the wilderness around Road 1502. Something that can appear and disappear like smoke. Something that commands respect from every other living thing in those forests. Something that's content to remain hidden most of the time, but isn't afraid to make contact when it chooses to. And the most terrifying part? I have no idea what would happen if it ever chose to make contact again. Story 4. I've been climbing mountains for most of my adult life, and I thought I understood what fear felt like. The kind of fear you get when you're hanging from a cliff face and your rope starts fraying, or when weather moves in faster than you expected and you're caught exposed on a ridge. But what happened to me and Jim on the north side of Mount Adams in 1991 was a completely different kind of terror. the kind that changes you at a fundamental level and makes you question everything you thought you knew about what shares this world with us. Jim's been my climbing partner for years. We'd done dozens of trips together, everything from day hikes to week-long expeditions in the Cascades. He knows the mountains as well as anyone, and he's not the type to spook easily. That's important for you to understand, because what I'm about to tell you affected both of us so deeply that we've never gone back to that area, not once in over 30 years. We'd driven up to Mount Adams on a Friday afternoon in late August. The plan was simple: spend the weekend car camping and do some day climbs on the less popular northern routes. Jim had just gotten this golden retriever puppy, maybe 4 months old, and he wanted to start getting the dog used to being outdoors. The puppy was this adorable little ball of energy, constantly getting into everything and following us around like we were the most interesting things in the world. We found a good spot to set up camp near a small creek, maybe half a mile off the main forest road. Remote enough that we wouldn't be bothered by other campers, but accessible enough that we could get the truck in and out without too much trouble. The area was beautiful, old-growth forest with these massive Douglas firs and cedars, clear mountain water, and views of the peak through the canopy. By the time we had our camp set up and dinner cooked, it was getting dark. We built up a nice campfire and settled in for the evening, just talking about our plans for the next day's climbs. The puppy was exhausted from all the new experiences and had curled up between our chairs, occasionally lifting his head when he heard an unfamiliar sound from the forest. Everything was completely normal, peaceful even, the kind of evening that makes you grateful to live in the Pacific Northwest, where you can drive a couple hours and be in wilderness that feels untouched by civilization. Around 10:30 or 11, I needed to take a piss. The creek was maybe 20 feet from our campsite, down a little path that wound through the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down toward the water, not thinking much about it. Just a routine bathroom break before turning in for the night. The path was easy to follow even in the dark, and I could hear the creek babbling ahead of me. I'd made it maybe halfway down when I stopped to unzip my pants. That's when everything changed. The moment my feet stopped moving, I heard other footsteps, not mine, someone else's, or something else's. They were coming from across the creek, maybe 20 feet away, crunching through the dry gravel and small rocks that lined the stream bed. At first I thought it might be another camper, maybe someone else had set up nearby and was also answering nature's call. But something felt wrong immediately. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Each step was placed with a weight and intention that didn't match how a person normally walks in the dark. I froze completely, not even breathing, trying to listen. That's when I realized the timing was off. When I'd stopped walking, the other footsteps had continued for just a beat too long, like whatever was making them had been mirroring my movement and needed that extra split second to realize I'd stopped. The intelligence in that slight delay sent ice water through my veins. This wasn't some random animal that had wandered down to the creek. This was something that had been deliberately matching my pace, staying synchronized with my movement. Something that was aware of me and was trying not to be detected. I stood there in complete silence, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear anything else. The normal night sounds of the forest, insects chirping, small animals moving through the underbrush, the wind in the trees, seemed to have stopped completely. The only sound was the creek flowing and my heart pounding so hard I was afraid whatever was out there could hear it. That's when I slowly reached for my sidearm. I always carry when we're camping in remote areas. Black bear and cougar country, you know. My hand was shaking as I drew the pistol, but I tried to do it as quietly as possible. The last thing I wanted was to make any sudden movements that might provoke whatever was watching me from across that creek. Back at the campsite, I could hear the puppy starting to whine. Not the normal puppy sounds he'd been making all day, but anxious, frightened whining. Then I heard Jim's voice, low and urgent, calling the dog over to him. I realized Jim could see me from where he was sitting by the fire. He could see that I'd drawn my weapon and was standing stock still on the path, obviously focused on something he couldn't see. That's when I heard the metallic click of Jim pulling his own pistol from his holster. The sound seemed to trigger something across the creek. I heard 2 heavy footsteps moving uphill away from the water. Not running, not hurried, just 2 deliberate steps. Then silence again. I waited another 30 seconds before I slowly turned my head to look in the direction the footsteps had gone. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I had this overwhelming sense that something was still there, still watching, still deciding what to do next. That's when it moved again. 2 more steps further uphill, and then I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. A shape, darker than the surrounding forest, maybe 50 yards away and moving up the slope parallel to the creek. It was tall, much taller than a person should be, and it moved with a fluid gait that wasn't quite human. The shape paused for a moment and turned back toward me. Even in the darkness, I could make out what looked like a head turning in my direction. And then I saw them. 2 points of reflected light where eyes should be. Not the bright reflection you get from a deer or other animal when light hits their eyes. These were different, duller, but unmistakably intelligent. For maybe 3 seconds, we looked at each other across that dark forest. 3 seconds that felt like an hour. I could feel the weight of its attention, the intelligence behind those eyes studying me just as intensely as I was studying it. Then it looked away, almost casually, and took another couple of steps uphill before disappearing completely into the forest. Not hiding behind trees or ducking down, just gone, like it had melted into the shadows. I stood there for another minute, pistol still drawn, listening for any sign that it was coming back, but the forest had gone completely silent. Even the creek seemed quieter. Finally, I backed slowly up the path toward the campfire, never taking my eyes off the area where I'd seen those reflected points of light. When I reached the campsite, Jim was standing with his back to the fire, his own weapon drawn, scanning the tree line. The puppy was pressed against his legs, trembling and whining softly. "What did you see?" Jim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something big," I said. "Across the creek. It was watching me." Jim nodded grimly. "The dog started going crazy about 2 minutes ago, hair standing up, growling at something out there. Then I saw you draw your weapon." We looked at each other without saying anything else. We both knew we'd encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist, but neither of us wanted to be the first to say it out loud. The puppy was still trembling, pressed as close to Jim as he could get. This was a dog that had been fearless all day, bouncing around the campsite, investigating every new smell and sound. Now he looked terrified, constantly glancing toward the tree line, like he expected something to come charging out of the darkness. "We should go," Jim said finally. I nodded. "Yeah, we should go." We didn't discuss it further. We just started breaking down camp as quietly and efficiently as possible. Jim kept the puppy close while I doused the fire and packed our gear. The whole time, I had this crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, like something was still out there watching us. Loading the truck felt like the longest 10 minutes of my life. Every shadow could be hiding something massive. Every sound from the forest could be the prelude to an attack. The puppy refused to be put down, clinging to Jim like his life depended on it. When we finally got everything loaded and the truck started, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as we drove down that forest road, headlights cutting through the darkness, I kept checking the mirrors. Part of me expected to see something large step onto the road behind us, or catch a glimpse of those reflected eyes watching us from the tree line. We drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. The puppy had finally stopped whining, but was still pressed against Jim's leg, alert. and nervous. Finally, Jim spoke up. "That wasn't a bear," he said. "No, it wasn't. It wasn't human either." I thought about those eyes looking back at me, the intelligence I'd sensed in that brief moment of eye contact. No, it definitely wasn't human. We never talked about what we thought it actually was. We didn't need to. We both knew what we'd encountered, even if neither of us wanted to say the word out loud. Some things are too big, too impossible to discuss directly. You just file them away in your memory and try to make sense of them later. I've replayed that encounter thousands of times in my head over the past 30+ years. The weight of those footsteps in the gravel, the deliberate way it had matched my movement until I stopped, the casual intelligence in how it had studied me and then chosen to leave rather than confront me. What haunts me most is that moment of eye contact, the sense that whatever I was looking at was every bit as aware of me as I was of it, that it had made a conscious decision about whether I was a threat, whether I was worth confronting, whether it should reveal more of itself or simply disappear back into the wilderness. The puppy never got over it. Jim told me later that the dog developed a permanent fear of the outdoors. This little guy who'd been so eager to explore became anxious and clingy whenever they went camping. He'd stay pressed against Jim's legs, constantly scanning the tree line like he was watching for something to emerge from the forest. Jim and I never went back to that area. We've done dozens of climbs on other peaks, but Mount Adams holds no appeal for either of us anymore. There's something about knowing that wilderness harbors things we don't understand that changes how you interact with it. The mountains feel different now, less like a playground and more like someone else's territory that we're allowed to visit only under certain conditions. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made a different choice that night. What if I'd called out to whatever was across the creek? What if I'd shined my flashlight directly at those eyes instead of just catching them in my peripheral vision? What if I'd stood my ground instead of backing away? But honestly, I think backing away was the right call. There was something in that brief moment of eye contact that suggested this encounter could have gone very differently if I'd been seen as aggressive or threatening. The fact that it chose to leave rather than confront me feels like a gift, like I was being allowed to walk away from something that could have ended very badly. I don't tell this story often. Most people either think you're lying or they want to turn it into some kind of adventure tale. But this wasn't an adventure. It was a reminder that there are things in this world that are older, stronger, and more intelligent than we are. Things that usually choose to remain hidden, but occasionally decide to make their presence known. The Pacific Northwest has thousands of square miles of wilderness where a person could disappear without a trace, where something large and intelligent could live its entire life without being conclusively documented, where ancient things might still roam the deep forests, watching us from the shadows and deciding when and if to make contact. All I know for certain is that on that night in 1991, I looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, according to everything we're taught about the natural world. Something that was every bit as real as the ground under my feet and the gun in my hand. Something that chose to let me walk away with nothing more than a story that most people will never believe. And honestly, part of me hopes it stays that way. Story 5. I was just a kid when this happened, maybe 8 or 9 years old, but I remember every single detail like it was yesterday. Some experiences burn themselves into your memory so deep that time doesn't fade them at all. What I saw that evening in 1981 near Mays, Kansas, changed me fundamentally. It's the reason I developed a fear of the dark that lasted well into my 20s, and why I still can't sleep alone in complete darkness even now. We lived in this old farmhouse that sat right in the middle of a field, maybe 2 miles outside of Mays. The house had been there since the 1920s or 30s, one of those typical Kansas farmhouses with a big front porch and rooms that always seemed too hot in summer and too cold in winter. What made our property unique were the lines of trees that surrounded the field on three sides. These weren't just random trees scattered around. They were planted in deliberate rows, probably as windbreaks back when the farm was more active. Tall cottonwoods and elms mostly, thick enough that you couldn't see through them, even in winter when the leaves were gone. On the side that faced toward the Arkansas River, the tree line was particularly dense, maybe 50 feet deep, before it opened up into the wooded area that stretched all the way down to the water. I spent a lot of time outside as a kid. This was back when parents didn't worry as much about letting their children roam around unsupervised. I'd explore those tree lines constantly, building forts, looking for interesting rocks or bird nests, just being a curious kid with too much energy and too much imagination. That particular evening was warm for early fall, probably mid-September. I'd finished my homework and eaten dinner, and there was still maybe an hour of daylight left. My mom was doing dishes and my dad was watching the news, so I asked if I could go outside to play for a while before it got dark. I remember walking across our field toward the tree line that faced the river area. The sun was getting low, casting those long shadows that make everything look different than it does in full daylight. There was a slight breeze moving through the grass, and I could hear the usual evening sounds. Birds settling in for the night, insects starting their nighttime chorus, maybe a dog barking somewhere in the distance. I was probably 20 feet from the trees when it hit me. This overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. Not the kind of feeling you get when you think someone might be looking at you from a window. This was deeper, more primitive. Like every survival instinct I had was suddenly screaming that something was wrong. I stopped walking and just stood there in the field, trying to figure out what had spooked me. The rational part of my brain, even at 8 years old, was telling me I was just being silly. It was probably just a rabbit or a squirrel moving around in the underbrush, but the feeling wouldn't go away. If anything, it was getting stronger. That's when I started scanning the tree line more carefully, looking for whatever was making me feel so uneasy. I checked the obvious spots first, gaps between the larger trees where something might be hiding. Low branches that could conceal a crouching figure, anywhere that seemed like a logical place for an animal to position itself. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the fading light. You know how shadows can play games with your eyes, especially when you're already on edge. But as I focused on the spot, adjusting my glasses to make sure I was seeing clearly, the details became unmistakable. There was a face watching me from behind what looked like a fallen tree trunk. A face that was definitely not human, but not quite animal either. It was positioned so that just the head was visible, like whatever it was had carefully positioned itself to observe me while staying mostly hidden. The skin was a dark gray color, almost charcoal, with a texture that looked rough and weathered. The head had an unusual shape, broader at the top and tapering down to a narrower chin area, almost like a cone, but not perfectly symmetrical. There was something about the proportions that was deeply unsettling, like seeing a face in a funhouse mirror that's been stretched in all the wrong directions. But it was the eyes that really got to me. They were huge, much larger than human eyes should be, and completely black. Not just dark brown or deep blue, actually black, like looking into two holes in the creature's face. They were positioned slightly wider apart than eyes should be on a human head, and they were focused directly on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The nose was broad and flat, spread across the width of the face in a way that looked almost like it had been pressed down. I couldn't make out if there were actual nostrils from the distance I was at, but the whole nose structure looked more like a smudged area of darker skin than a distinct facial feature. The mouth was probably the most disturbing part. It was wide, stretching almost from one side of the face to the other, but it was just a thin line. Two lips of equal thickness, pressed together in what might have been a neutral expression or might have been barely concealed hostility. There was something about that mouth that suggested intelligence, like whatever this thing was, it was capable of communication even if it chose not to speak. I stood there staring at this face for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. During that time, it never blinked, never moved, never changed expression. It just watched me with those huge black eyes, and I got the distinct impression that it was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. The whole time, my brain was trying to process what I was seeing. At 8 years old, I didn't have a frame of reference for something like this. It wasn't a person, wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about the world. That's when the curiosity started mixing with the fear. Yes, I was terrified. Every instinct I had was telling me to run back to the house as fast as my legs could carry me. But I was also fascinated. This was clearly something extraordinary, something that might disappear if I looked away even for a second. I remember adjusting my glasses again, trying to get the clearest possible view. The light was fading fast, and I wanted to make sure I was really seeing what I thought I was seeing. But the adjustment of my glasses seemed to trigger something in the creature. For the first time since I'd spotted it, it moved. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. It pulled back slightly, like it had realized I was getting a clear look at it and decided that was more exposure than it wanted. The face didn't disappear completely, but it retreated deeper into the shadows behind the fallen tree. That small movement broke whatever spell had been holding me in place. Suddenly, the full weight of the situation hit me. I was alone in a field at dusk, staring at something that absolutely should not exist, with no adult anywhere nearby and no clear understanding of whether this thing was dangerous or not. The fear won out over the curiosity. I turned and ran back toward the house as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But I couldn't resist looking back over my shoulder as I ran. I needed to know if it was following me, if it was going to chase me across that open field. When I glanced back, the face was gone. The tree line looked completely normal, just shadows and branches and the ordinary darkness of approaching night. But somehow that was almost more terrifying than if I had seen it watching me. Now I had no idea where it was or what it might be doing. I made it to the house and burst through the back door, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. My mom took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What happened? Are you okay?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, talking fast and probably not making much sense. I told her about the gray face with the huge black eyes, about how it had been watching me from behind the fallen tree, about how it had pulled back into the shadows when I adjusted my glasses. My mom listened to the whole story, but I could see the skepticism in her expression. When I finished, she gave me that look parents give their kids when they're trying to be understanding, but don't really believe what they're hearing. "Honey, it's getting dark out there. Sometimes shadows can look like faces when the light is playing tricks on you. Your imagination is very active, and you might have just thought you saw something that wasn't really there." I tried to convince her that what I'd seen was real, that it wasn't just shadows or imagination. But the more I insisted, the more she seemed to think I was just overreacting to some perfectly ordinary sight that my young brain had misinterpreted. "Why don't you get your binoculars?" she suggested. "If there's really something out there, we can take a look together." That seemed like a good idea. My dad had gotten me a pair of binoculars for bird watching, and they were pretty decent quality. If that thing was still out there, the binoculars would let me see it clearly enough to prove to my mom that I wasn't imagining things. I ran to my room and grabbed the binoculars, then hurried back outside with my mom following behind me. But by the time we got back to the field, it was almost completely dark. The tree line was just a black mass against the slightly lighter sky, with no details visible even with the binoculars. We stood out there for maybe 10 minutes, with me scanning the area where I'd seen the face, and my mom patiently humoring what she clearly thought was a frightened child's overactive imagination. But there was nothing to see. Whatever had been watching me was either gone or hidden too deeply in the shadows to spot. "I think you probably saw an owl or a raccoon," my mom said as we headed back to the house. "Sometimes animals can look very strange when you only see part of them in poor light." But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't an owl or a raccoon. The intelligence in those black eyes, the deliberate way it had positioned itself to observe me, the careful retreat when it realized I was getting a clear look, none of that matched animal behavior. This was something that understood it was being watched and made conscious decisions about how much of itself to reveal. That night was the beginning of my fear of the dark. Up until then, I'd been a pretty fearless kid. I'd sleep with my bedroom door closed and no nightlight, camp out in the backyard, explore the woods behind our house after sunset. But after seeing that face in the tree line, darkness became threatening. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there somewhere, watching our house, waiting for another opportunity to observe us. Every shadow could be hiding those huge black eyes. Every sound from outside could be footsteps moving closer to our windows. I started sleeping with my bedroom door open and the hallway light on. I'd lie awake for hours, listening to every creak and settling sound the old house made, wondering if something was trying to get inside. When I did finally fall asleep, I'd have nightmares about that gray face with its cone-shaped head and unblinking stare. The fear got so bad that I couldn't sleep alone in my room anymore. For months after the encounter, I'd end up in my parents' bed at least 3 or 4 nights a week, too terrified to stay by myself in the dark. My mom and dad were patient about it, but I could tell they were getting frustrated with what they saw as an irrational fear that I should have been able to overcome. My older brother thought the whole thing was hilarious. He'd tease me about being scared of monsters, make jokes about the face in the trees, and occasionally try to spook me by making weird noises outside my bedroom window. But when I tried to tell him the details of what I'd seen, he just laughed harder. The only person who took me seriously was my grandmother. When I described the encounter to her a few weeks later, she got very quiet and asked me to tell her every detail I could remember. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she just nodded. "There are things in this world that most people don't see," she said. "Things that are older than our towns and our farms. Just because the grown-ups don't believe you doesn't mean you didn't see something real." That validation meant everything to me. For the first time since the encounter, someone was telling me that my experience might have been genuine, that I hadn't just imagined or misinterpreted something ordinary. As the months passed, the acute fear started to fade, but it never completely went away. I remained nervous about being outside alone after dark, and I continued sleeping with some kind of light on well into my teenage years. Even now, as an adult, I prefer to have at least a small lamp on when I'm sleeping by myself. I never saw the creature again, though I looked for it many times. I'd walk out to that same tree line during daylight, searching for any sign of what I'd encountered. I found the fallen tree where it had hidden, but there were no footprints, no physical evidence that anything unusual had been there. But I knew what I'd seen. The memory hasn't faded at all in the decades since it happened. I can still picture every detail of that grey face, the shape of the head, the placement of those enormous black eyes, the width of that thin-lipped mouth. The image is burned into my memory as clearly as if I'd taken a photograph. What disturbs me most is the intelligence I sensed in that brief encounter. This wasn't some wild animal that had wandered into an unusual position where it looked vaguely humanoid from a distance. This was something that understood it was observing a human child, something that made deliberate choices about how much of itself to reveal and when to retreat. The fact that it never showed itself again, despite my many attempts to spot it, suggests that it learned from our encounter. It realized that it had been seen and decided to be more careful in the future. That level of reasoning and adaptation isn't something you'd expect from any ordinary creature. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, perhaps still near the Arkansas River, still watching people from the shadows. I wonder how many other children might have had similar encounters, but were dismissed by adults who thought they were just seeing things or letting their imaginations run wild. What I saw that evening in 1981 was real. I know how that sounds. I know how unlikely it seems. But I also know what my eyes showed me. There are things in this world that exist outside our normal understanding, things that occasionally reveal themselves to people who happen to be in the right place at the right time to witness something extraordinary. The creature in the tree line chose to let me see it, studied me just as intently as I studied it, and then made the decision to disappear back into whatever hidden world it came from. I was 8 years old, alone in a field at dusk, and for just a few seconds, the barrier between the known and unknown world became transparent. That grey face with its huge black eyes is still watching me from my memories, still as vivid and impossible as it was on that September evening over 40 years ago. And sometimes, in the moments just before I fall asleep, I wonder if somewhere out there, it's still watching. Story 6. I was 12 years old when this happened, and I'm 40-something now, but I can still remember every single detail like it happened yesterday. Some experiences just burn themselves into your memory so deep that time doesn't fade them at all. What happened to me and my dad at Salt Fork State Park in Ohio was one of those experiences that changes how you see the world forever. My dad had been taking me hunting since I was maybe 8 years old. Nothing too serious at first, just teaching me how to be quiet in the woods, how to read animal signs, basic gun safety. By the time I was 12, he figured I was ready for a real hunting trip, just the two of us camping out in the primitive area of Salt Fork and trying to bag a deer during the early season. Salt Fork State Park is huge, over 17,000 acres of forest and hills in southeastern Ohio. The primitive camping area was way back in the woods, miles from the main campground where families stayed in RVs and cabins. It was just a few cleared spots where you could pitch a tent or set up a small camper with pit toilets and a hand pump for water. Perfect for hunters who wanted to get away from civilization and actually experience the wilderness. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in late October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and there was that crisp smell in the air that tells you winter's coming. Dad had borrowed his buddy's truck camper, one of those small units that fits in the bed of a pickup truck. It wasn't fancy, but it had a little table, a couple of bunks, and a small propane heater. More than enough for a weekend hunting trip. We got to the campsite around 4 in the afternoon, and spent the next couple of hours setting up camp and scouting the area. Dad wanted to show me some deer trails he'd found on previous trips, teach me how to read the signs that would tell us where to position ourselves in the morning. I was excited. This was my first real hunting trip without my older cousins or my uncle tagging along. Just me and Dad, man to man. That night, we cooked some hot dogs over a small camp stove and went over the plan for the next morning. We'd be up before sunrise, move quietly to a spot Dad had picked out overlooking a valley where deer like to feed, and wait for them to come through. He stressed the importance of staying absolutely silent once we were in position. Any sound could spook the deer and ruin our chances. By 9 o'clock, we were both tired from the drive and the setup, so we decided to turn in early. I climbed into the upper bunk, and Dad took the lower one. The camper was small enough that we were maybe 3 feet apart, which was actually kind of comforting. I'd never been camping this far from civilization before, and the sounds of the forest at night were still pretty new to me. I remember lying there listening to all the normal night sounds, owls hooting in the distance, small animals rustling through the leaves, branches creaking in the wind. Dad was snoring softly below me, and I was just starting to drift off when I heard something that made me wide awake again. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the dry leaves around our campsite. At first, I thought it might be another hunter coming back late from scouting, but something about the rhythm was wrong. The steps were too slow, too measured, and they seemed to be circling our camper. I lay there perfectly still, trying to figure out what I was hearing. The footsteps would move from one side of the camper to the other, pause for a few seconds, then continue around to another side. Whatever was making them was big. Each step seemed to press deep into the forest floor, making more noise than a person normally would. That's when I felt the camper shake slightly. Just a small movement, like something had bumped into the side of it. Then I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Something running its hand or fingers along the aluminum siding of the camper. A scraping sound, like long fingernails or claws dragging across metal. The scraping moved from the back of the camper toward the front, maybe 6 feet above the ground, way too high for a person to reach comfortably. I wanted to wake up my dad, but I was too scared to move or make any sound. The scraping continued for what felt like forever, moving around the entire perimeter of the camper. Then I heard a sound that I still can't really describe properly. It was low and rumbling, almost like a growl, but with a quality that seemed almost curious, like whatever was out there was trying to understand what our camper was, trying to figure out if we were a threat or just something interesting it had stumbled across. The whole time this was happening, Dad kept snoring. I couldn't believe he was sleeping through it, but I guess he was more tired than I was, and the sounds weren't as loud inside the camper as they seemed to me. I just lay there in my bunk, too terrified to move, listening to whatever was outside, investigate our campsite. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, the sounds stopped. No more footsteps, no more scraping, no more growling. Just the normal forest sounds again. I lay awake for the rest of the night, straining to hear any sign that the thing was coming back, but everything stayed quiet. When Dad's alarm went off at 5 in the morning, I was exhausted, but relieved that daylight was finally coming. I didn't say anything about what I'd heard, partly because I wasn't sure Dad would believe me, and partly because I didn't want to sound like a scared kid on my first real hunting trip. We got dressed quietly, grabbed our rifles, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. Dad led the way with a small flashlight, following a trail that wound up into the hills, overlooking the valley, where he expected to see deer. I stayed close behind him, trying to step exactly where he stepped to avoid making noise. The spot he'd chosen was perfect. A small clearing on a ridge with a clear view down into a meadow where several deer trails converged. We settled in behind a fallen log and waited for the sun to come up and the deer to start moving. The first hour was perfect. As the sky started getting lighter, I could see the valley spreading out below us, thick with morning mist and absolutely beautiful. This was what hunting was supposed to be like, quiet, peaceful, connected to nature. I was starting to forget about the scary sounds from the night before. Around 7:30, I saw movement in the trees across the valley. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but as I watched through my scope, I realized it was too big and moving wrong. Something large was making its way through the forest, snapping branches and not trying to be quiet at all. I nudged Dad and pointed toward the movement. He looked through his binoculars for a few seconds, then lowered them with a confused expression on his face. That's when we both got a clear look at what was moving through those trees. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything that was supposed to exist in the forests of Ohio. The creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall when it stood upright, which it did frequently as it moved through the forest. It was covered in dark brown or black hair, with incredibly long arms and a broad chest. But what really got my attention was how it moved. Sometimes it would walk on two legs like a person, other times it would drop down and move on all fours like an animal. The transition between the two gaits was fluid and natural, like this thing was equally comfortable either way. It was maybe 100 yards away from us, close enough that we could see details even without the binoculars. The head was large and cone-shaped, with what looked like a pronounced brow ridge. When it turned in our direction, I could see that its face was darker than the rest of its body, almost black, with deep-set eyes that seemed to be scanning the area around us. Dad and I just sat there, watching this thing move through the forest below us. Neither of us said anything. We both knew we were seeing something incredible and impossible. The creature moved with purpose, like it was following a specific route or looking for something particular. It would stop occasionally, stand up on its hind legs, and survey the area before continuing on. That's when it spotted us. I'm not sure exactly what gave us away. Maybe the sun reflecting off Dad's binoculars. Maybe we moved at the wrong moment. Or maybe this thing just had incredibly sharp senses. But suddenly it stopped, stood up to its full height, and looked directly at our position on the ridge. For maybe 10 seconds, we stared at each other across that valley. The creature was perfectly still, just studying us with what seemed like intelligence and caution. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I sensed Dad tensing up beside me. Then the creature did something that I still can't explain. It started swaying back and forth, shifting its weight from one foot to the other, while making that same low, growling sound I'd heard outside the camper the night before. But this wasn't aggressive growling. It was more like communication. Like it was trying to tell us something or establish some kind of contact. The swaying motion was almost hypnotic. The creature would lean to one side, pause, then lean to the other side, all while maintaining eye contact with us. Its arms hung loose at its sides, and its posture didn't seem threatening. If anything, it looked curious about us, maybe even cautious. Dad slowly reached for his rifle, and that's when everything changed. The moment Dad's hand touched his gun, the creature's entire demeanor shifted. The swaying stopped, and it let out a sound that was definitely a growl this time. Not curious or communicative, warning, aggressive. The message was clear: don't even think about it. That's when Dad did something that probably saved both our lives. Instead of picking up his rifle, he slowly moved his hand away from it and held both hands up where the creature could see them, like he was surrendering. The creature watched this gesture for a moment, then seemed to relax slightly. The aggressive posturing stopped, and it went back to that cautious, curious stance. But the message had been delivered and received. This thing was aware of our weapons and was letting us know that any hostile move would be met with retaliation. Dad leaned over and whispered directly into my ear, so quietly I could barely hear him. Don't move. Don't touch your gun. Just watch. We sat there for another few minutes, just observing each other across that valley. The creature seemed to be assessing us, deciding whether we were a threat that needed to be dealt with or just something it could ignore. Finally, it seemed to reach a conclusion. Without any warning or farewell gesture, it simply turned and walked away. Not running, not hurried, just a casual departure, like it had finished its business and was moving on to other things. It moved deeper into the forest, and within a few minutes we couldn't see it anymore. Dad and I sat in complete silence for maybe another hour. Neither of us knew what to say about what we'd just witnessed. Finally, Dad stood up and started gathering his gear. "We're leaving," he said quietly, "right now." I didn't argue. Whatever we'd just encountered, I had no desire to meet it again, especially not if it decided we were unwelcome in its territory. We made our way back to the campsite as quickly and quietly as possible. As we were packing up the camper, Dad examined the sides of the vehicle. There were scratches in the aluminum, exactly where I'd heard the scraping sounds during the night. Long, parallel scratches that looked like they'd been made by claws or very large fingernails. The scratches were about 6 feet off the ground, exactly where I'd heard them being made. "You heard it last night, didn't you?" Dad asked. I nodded. It was walking around the camper, scratching the sides. I was too scared to wake you up. Dad looked at the scratches again, then at me. I'm glad you didn't. I'm not sure what would have happened if we'd confronted it in the dark. We drove home in mostly silence. Dad made me promise not to tell anyone about what we'd seen, at least not right away. He said people wouldn't believe us, and it might cause problems if word got out that there was something like that living in the state park. But the more I think about it now, the more I realize the creature wasn't just living in the park. It was protecting it. The way it had positioned itself in that valley, the confidence with which it had approached our campsite, the territorial behavior when Dad reached for his weapon. This thing considered that forest its home, and it was letting us know that we were guests who could be asked to leave at any time. What still gives me chills is remembering how intelligent it seemed, the way it had studied us, the deliberate communication through posture and sound, the strategic way it had revealed itself only after assessing our threat level. This wasn't some dumb animal acting on instinct. This was something that could think, plan, and make complex decisions about how to interact with humans. Dad never went back to Salt Fork State Park. He found other places to hunt, always making excuses about why we shouldn't return to that particular spot. I think the encounter affected him just as much as it affected me, maybe more. He'd been hunting for 30 years and thought he knew everything that lived in Ohio's forests. Finding out he was wrong about something that fundamental shook him pretty deeply. I've been back to Salt Fork as an adult, but never to the primitive camping area where we had our encounter. I stick to the main campground, the hiking trails that see regular foot traffic, the areas where there are always other people around. The deep woods hold no appeal for me anymore. I know what lives back there, watching from the shadows, deciding whether humans are welcome or not. Sometimes I wonder how many other hunters have had similar encounters but never reported them. How many people have seen things in the forest that they knew nobody would believe? How many times has this creature, or others like it, made the decision to reveal itself to humans and then disappeared back into the wilderness? What I know for certain is that there are things living in our forests that are older, stronger, and smarter than we give them credit for. Things that have learned to stay hidden but aren't afraid to make contact when they feel it's necessary. Things that understand our weapons, our behavior, our intentions, and make calculated decisions about how to respond. That creature in Salt Fork State Park could have hurt us easily. Instead, it chose to communicate, to warn, and ultimately to let us leave unharmed. I was 12 years old, holding a rifle in what it probably considered its home territory. Yet it showed more restraint and intelligence than many humans would have in a similar situation. I still hunt occasionally, but always with the awareness that I might be sharing the forest with something that's watching me, evaluating me, deciding whether I'm welcome. It's changed how I move through the wilderness, how I interpret sounds and shadows, how I think about my place in the natural world. And sometimes, late at night when I'm camping, I listen for the sound of heavy footsteps circling my tent and wonder if that same intelligence is still out there, still protecting its territory, still deciding which humans pose a threat and which can be allowed to pass through safely. The scratches on Dad's camper faded over time, but my memory of that encounter remains as vivid as ever. 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, moving between 2 legs and 4 with equal ease, intelligent enough to communicate through gesture and sound, real enough to leave physical evidence of its presence, real enough to change everything I thought I knew about what shares this world with us. Story 7. I've been hunting on my grandparents' property for over 20 years, and I thought I knew every inch of those hills like the back of my hand. The old mountain has always felt like home to me, familiar trails, familiar sounds, familiar dangers. But what happened to me and my brother-in-law up there last fall changed everything I thought I knew about that place. Changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in those deep woods. My grandparents owned about 300 acres of mountain land, most of it steep and heavily forested. The kind of terrain that's perfect for deer and turkey, but tough enough that most hunters won't bother with it. There's one old logging road that winds up to the top of the ridge, but it's been washed out in places, and you need four-wheel drive just to make it halfway up. That particular morning started out normal enough. It was early November, perfect hunting weather, cold enough that the deer would be moving, but not so cold that you couldn't sit still for hours waiting for them. My brother-in-law had driven up from Tennessee to hunt with me, and we'd planned to work our way up the old road to check some spots I hadn't visited in a while. We parked at the bottom of the mountain around 6 in the morning, just as it was starting to get light. The plan was to walk up the old road, then split off onto some of the game trails that led to the higher ridges where I'd seen sign before. Nothing complicated, just a day of exploring and hopefully filling our tags. We'd hiked maybe a mile up the mountain when we ran into another hunter coming down fast. I mean, this guy was moving with purpose, almost jogging down that rough trail. When he saw us, he stopped and looked genuinely relieved to see other people. He was breathing hard and sweating despite the cold morning air. "You guys need to be careful up there," he said, gesturing back toward the upper part of the mountain. "There's a lynx or something stalking around. Thing jumped right at me about half an hour ago." I thanked him for the warning, but honestly, I was skeptical. We don't have many lynx in our area, and the ones we do have generally avoid humans. Plus, this guy seemed more spooked than someone who just had a close call with a wild cat. But I figured better safe than sorry, and we made sure our rifles were loaded and ready as we continued up the trail. The old logging road gets steep about halfway up the mountain, winding back and forth through switchbacks that were cut maybe 50 years ago. Some sections have been completely washed out by spring runoff, and others are so overgrown you have to push through branches just to stay on the path. But I've been walking that trail since I was a kid, so I know where all the rough spots are. We made it to the top of the ridge around 8:30. There's a small clearing up there where the old loggers used to stage their equipment, and it gives you a good view down into the valley on the other side of the mountain. Perfect spot to stop, catch our breath, and decide which direction to hunt. That's when we started hearing the sounds. At first, it sounded like turkey calls. You know that gobbling sound turkeys make when they're trying to communicate with each other? It was coming from a thick stand of young trees, maybe 100 yards away, down in a small hollow that was filled with dense undergrowth. My brother-in-law and I looked at each other and grinned. Turkey season was still open, and bagging a nice tom would make the whole trip worthwhile. We've both hunted turkeys before, so we knew the routine. Move quietly, try to get within range, and wait for a good shot opportunity. We started working our way down toward where the calls were coming from. The terrain was steep and covered with fallen leaves, so we had to move slowly to avoid making noise. Every few steps, we'd stop and listen for more calls to make sure we were heading in the right direction. The turkey calls continued as we got closer, but something about them started to seem off. The timing was wrong. Too regular, too repetitive. Real turkeys usually call and then listen for responses. These calls just kept coming in the same pattern, over and over again. As we got within maybe 50 yards of the source, the calls started changing. They were still recognizable as turkey sounds, but they were getting deeper, more guttural, like whatever was making them was losing interest in sounding like a turkey and was letting its real voice come through. That's when my brother-in-law grabbed my arm and whispered that we should stop and reassess the situation. He'd been turkey hunting longer than I had, and he said something wasn't right about what we were hearing. The calls were too perfect, too consistent, like something was imitating a turkey rather than actually being one. We crouched down behind a large oak tree and just listened for a few minutes. The calls continued, but now they were definitely changing. Less like turkey gobbles and more like growls, deep rumbling sounds that no turkey could possibly make. Then the growling stopped, and we heard something that made both of us freeze. Wood knocking. The unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting tree trunks in a deliberate pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks again. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I know every sound they make naturally. Branches falling, trees creaking in the wind, woodpeckers hammering, all of that is normal. But this was different. This was intentional. Something was using wood as a tool to make noise, and it was doing it in a pattern that suggested intelligence. The wood knocking was coming from behind us now, from the direction we'd just come down. Whatever was making the sounds had moved, and it was positioned between us and the way back up to the ridge. That realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the November cold. My brother-in-law looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. He's an experienced hunter, been in the woods his whole life, served in the military. But right then, he looked genuinely scared. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. "Right now." I couldn't argue with him. Every instinct I had was telling me that we'd stumbled into something we shouldn't have. The fake turkey calls, the growling, the intentional wood knocking, none of it fit any normal wildlife behavior. Something was out there in those woods, something that was intelligent enough to use sound as a tool and clever enough to try luring us in with imitations of familiar animal calls. We started backing away from the area, trying to put distance between us and whatever was making those sounds. But we had to be careful. The terrain was steep and covered with deadfall, and the last thing we wanted was to make a lot of noise that would give away our position. The wood knocking followed us, not continuously, but every few minutes we'd hear it again, always from a different direction. Whatever was out there was mobile, and it seemed to be tracking our movement. Sometimes the knocking would come from uphill, sometimes from the side, sometimes from behind us. It was like being herded. That's when the smell hit us. It was foul, like something that had been dead for a long time, but was still moving around. A mixture of rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I couldn't identify. Something wild and primitive that made every survival instinct I had start screaming. The smell was strong enough that we could follow it, track where whatever was producing it had been moving through the forest, and the path it had taken was concerning. It seemed to be circling our position, staying just out of sight but close enough that we could detect its presence. My brother-in-law had his rifle ready, but I could see his hands shaking. Mine weren't much steadier. We both knew we were dealing with something beyond our experience, something that the weapons we'd brought for deer hunting might not be adequate for. The wood knocking started getting more aggressive. Instead of the rhythmic patterns we'd heard before, it became random and violent, like something was taking out its frustration on the trees around us. The sounds were coming from multiple directions now, and they were getting closer. That's when we decided to make a run for it. We abandoned any pretense of stealth and started moving as fast as we could toward the old logging road. The terrain was rough, but fear gave us energy and coordination we wouldn't normally have had. Behind us, the wood knocking turned into what sounded like trees being broken apart. Not just branches, whole trunks snapping with sounds like gunshots. Whatever was back there was incredibly strong, strong enough to destroy mature trees in its apparent rage at our escape. We made it back to the logging road and started down the mountain as fast as the rough trail would allow. I kept looking back, expecting to see something massive crashing through the forest behind us, but the woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no normal forest sounds at all. Just an oppressive quiet that made the hair on my arms stand up. About halfway down the mountain, we stopped to catch our breath and assess our situation. We were both exhausted from the adrenaline and the difficult terrain, but we felt safer being on the established trail rather than stumbling through thick woods. That's when my brother-in-law pointed to something that made my blood run cold. There were tracks in the soft earth beside the trail. Not deer tracks, not bear tracks. Something with feet that looked almost human, but much larger. The prints were at least 16 inches long and showed clear toe impressions. But what really disturbed me was that these tracks weren't there when we'd walked up the trail that morning. I was certain of that. Whatever had made them had come down this way after we'd passed, maybe while we were up on the ridge dealing with the fake turkey calls and wood knocking. The spacing between the tracks suggested something with an enormous stride, something that could cover ground much faster than a human, and the depth of the impressions indicated incredible weight, much heavier than any person, probably heavier than any normal animal that should be living in those woods. We followed the tracks down the trail for maybe 100 yards, and they showed a consistent pattern. Whatever made them was walking upright on two legs, taking long, purposeful strides down the mountain. The tracks eventually left the trail and disappeared into the thick forest, heading toward the same area where we'd heard the fake turkey calls. At that point, we just wanted to get back to our truck and get off that mountain. We'd come up there to hunt deer, but we'd stumbled into something that was hunting us. The fake calls, the wood knocking, the tracking behavior. It all added up to an intelligence that was playing games with us, testing our responses, maybe deciding whether we were a threat that needed to be eliminated. When we finally made it back to the truck, we sat there for a few minutes, just trying to process what had happened. Neither of us wanted to be the first to say what we were both thinking. But eventually, my brother-in-law broke the silence. "There wasn't any lynx that guy ran into this morning," he said. I nodded. "No, it wasn't." We drove down the mountain in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we got back to town that we started talking about it, and even then, we kept our voices low and checked to make sure nobody else was listening. I went back up there a few months later, but not to hunt. I wanted to see if there was any more evidence of whatever we'd encountered. What I found in that area where we'd heard the fake turkey calls was deeply disturbing. There was a deer carcass, but it had been completely torn apart. Not eaten by scavengers, destroyed. Bones scattered over a wide area, with marks on them that looked like they'd been made by incredibly strong hands rather than teeth. And the bones that were intact showed evidence of having been deliberately broken open, like something had been extracting the marrow. There were more tracks in the area, and what looked like a daybed where something large had been resting. But the thing that really got to me was the trees. Several mature oaks had been broken off about 8 feet from the ground, snapped like matchsticks and left lying across the game trails. In the middle of all this destruction, I found a pile of what could only be described as scat. It was huge, at least 3 feet long and maybe 6 inches in diameter. Too big to come from any animal that should be living in those woods, and with contents that suggested a diet that included both plant and animal matter. I took pictures of everything, but I've never shown them to anyone. People would either think I was lying, or they'd want to go up there and investigate for themselves. After what I experienced, I don't think that would be a good idea for anyone. The old logging road on my grandparents' property leads to some of the most remote wilderness in our county. It's rugged terrain, where something large and intelligent could live for decades without being detected by anyone, except the occasional hunter who happens to wander into the wrong area. What we encountered up there wasn't just some wild animal acting on instinct. It was something that could plan, something that could use tools and sound to manipulate human behavior, something that understood enough about hunting to know how to turn the tables and become the predator instead of the prey. I still hunt, but never alone and never in that part of the mountain. My brother-in-law hasn't been back to our area since that day, and he's never fully explained to his wife why he suddenly lost interest in hunting trips. Sometimes I lie awake at night thinking about those fake turkey calls, wondering what would have happened if we'd been foolish enough to walk right into whatever was making them. Thinking about the intelligence behind the wood knocking, the way it had seemed to be driving us in a specific direction. Most of all, I think about those tracks beside the logging road and how they proved that something had been following us, had known exactly where we were and where we were going, something that had chosen to let us leave rather than confront us directly, something that might still be up there, watching the old logging road, waiting to see if any more curious hunters will be foolish enough to investigate the sounds coming from the deep woods. And the most terrifying part is that I have no idea what it would do if they did. Story 8. I've never told this story to anyone, not completely anyway. People think they know about my family's involvement with Thousand Trails, how we started those campgrounds back in the early 70s. But they don't know what we really encountered in those deep Washington forests. What I experienced while living alone in the woods near Chehalis is something that still haunts me 50 years later. My family was pioneering the campground business long before it became the huge industry it is today. We saw the potential in creating networks of private campgrounds across the country, places where families could enjoy nature without giving up basic amenities. It was ambitious, maybe even a little crazy, but we believed in the concept. The problem was that developing these campgrounds meant somebody had to live on site during the construction phase. The work crews would come in during the day, but at night, someone needed to be there to watch over the equipment, make sure nobody was vandalizing the work sites, and coordinate with the contractors who'd arrive early in the morning. That someone was me. I was in my 20s then, young and foolish enough to think living alone in a trailer deep in the Washington forest would be an adventure. The Chehalis site was our second location, and it was remote even by our standards, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. My setup was pretty basic. A small travel trailer parked in what would eventually become the main campground area, a generator for power, and a CB radio for emergency communication. The nearest neighbor was probably 10 miles away, and cell phones weren't even a dream back then. When darkness fell, I was completely isolated. The first few weeks were actually peaceful. I'd spend my days coordinating with the work crews, marking areas for RV sites and bathhouses, clearing trails through the forest. In the evenings, I'd cook dinner on a camp stove, read by lantern light, and fall asleep to the sounds of the forest settling in for the night. But as the days got shorter and the nights got longer, things started to change. It began with sounds. At first, I thought it was just normal forest noise that I wasn't used to. Living in the city your whole life doesn't prepare you for how different the wilderness sounds at night. Every creak, every rustle, every distant call can seem threatening when you're not familiar with what's making them. The sounds I started hearing, though, weren't normal. They'd begin around 10 or 11 at night, long after the usual forest sounds had settled into their nighttime rhythm. Heavy footsteps circling my trailer, but not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling gait of a bear. These were deliberate, measured steps that sounded almost human, but not quite right. The footsteps would start from one direction, maybe 50 yards out in the forest, and slowly work their way around my campsite in a wide circle. Sometimes they'd stop for long periods, and I'd convince myself that whatever was making them had moved on. Then they'd start again, closer this time, maybe 30 yards out. What really got to me was the bipedal nature of the movement. These weren't four-legged footsteps like you'd expect from wildlife. Whatever was out there was walking upright, taking deliberate steps that suggested intelligence and purpose, and it was big. Each footfall made more noise than a person should make, even someone trying to move quietly through thick forest. The circling behavior went on for weeks. Every night, like clockwork, the footsteps would begin their slow patrol around my trailer. I'd lie in my narrow bunk, listening to whatever was out there, methodically investigating my campsite. never getting close enough for me to see it clearly, but never going far enough away that I could relax. I started keeping a flashlight and a rifle within easy reach, but I never worked up the courage to actually go outside and confront whatever was making those sounds. Part of me was afraid of what I might see. Part of me was afraid I might not see anything at all, which would mean I was losing my mind from the isolation. The wood knocking started around the same time the footsteps became a regular occurrence. At first I thought it might be woodpeckers or maybe tree branches hitting each other in the wind. But the sounds were too regular, too purposeful. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks again. Always the same pattern, always from different directions. Sometimes the knocking would come from the same area where I'd heard the footsteps. Other times it would come from completely different parts of the forest, like there was more than one thing out there communicating with each other through these deliberate sounds. The worst part was the silence that would follow these incidents. All the normal night sounds, insects chirping, small animals moving through the underbrush, owls calling in the distance, would stop completely. The forest would become so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat, and the silence would last for hours. During the day, I'd walk around the area where I'd heard the footsteps, looking for tracks or other evidence of what was visiting my campsite. The ground was usually too hard or too covered with fallen leaves to show clear prints, but I did find broken branches at about 8 feet high, snapped clean like something incredibly strong had pushed through without bothering to duck. I also found what looked like daybeds in the thicker parts of the forest, areas where something large had been resting, with grass and small branches pressed down in rough oval shapes. The beds were huge, at least 7 feet long and maybe 3 feet wide, too big for any normal animal, but too crude to be human-made. After about 6 weeks of this nightly harassment, I was barely sleeping and starting to question my own sanity. The isolation was getting to me, and I began to wonder if the stress of living alone in the deep woods was making me imagine things that weren't really there. That's when I had my first clear sighting. It was around 2 in the morning, and I'd been lying awake listening to the usual footsteps circling my trailer. The sounds had been going on for maybe an hour when they suddenly stopped. Not gradually faded away like they usually did, but stopped abruptly, like whatever was making them had frozen in place. I waited for several minutes, straining to hear any indication of where the thing had gone. Then I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Something scratching at the aluminum siding of my trailer. Long, slow scratches, like claws or fingernails dragging across metal. The scratching started at the back of the trailer and slowly moved toward the front, about 6 feet off the ground. Whatever was making the sound was tall enough to reach that high without stretching and strong enough to score the metal with its claws. That's when I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and crept to the front window of the trailer. I had to know what was out there, even if it terrified me. I slowly pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. The forest looked normal, just shadows and moonlight filtering through the trees. Then something moved near the edge of the clearing, maybe 20 yards from my trailer. It was massive, at least 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur, walking upright on 2 legs. The proportions were wrong for a human, too broad in the shoulders, arms too long, head too large. But it moved with purpose and intelligence, not like a wild animal. The creature was in profile to me, moving slowly across the clearing like it was investigating the area around my trailer. When it stopped and turned in my direction, I got my first clear look at its face. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see that it wasn't entirely ape-like. The features were more human than I'd expected, but scaled up to impossible proportions. Heavy brow ridge, broad nose, thick lips, and the eyes. Even at that distance, I could see intelligence in those eyes. This thing was aware of me, aware of my trailer, aware that it was being observed. For maybe 10 seconds, we stared at each other through the window. The creature didn't seem threatened or aggressive, just curious, like it was trying to understand what I was and what I was doing in its territory. Then it simply turned and walked away. Not hurried, not defensive, just a casual departure, like it had satisfied its curiosity and was ready to move on to other things. It disappeared into the forest without making a sound, like something that massive had just melted into the shadows. I sat by that window for the rest of the night, rifle in my hands, waiting for it to come back. But the forest had returned to its normal nighttime sounds, and I never saw or heard anything else unusual. The next morning, I found footprints in the soft earth around my trailer. Huge prints, at least 18 inches long, with clear toe impressions and what looked like partial heel marks. The prints showed that the creature had indeed been circling my campsite, just as I'd suspected from the sounds. But what really disturbed me was the behavior pattern I could read in those tracks. The creature had approached my trailer systematically, investigating from different angles, getting closer each time. It had examined my generator, my water supply, my wood pile, like it was conducting a thorough reconnaissance of my setup. That's when I realized this wasn't random wildlife behavior. This thing had been studying me, learning my routines, maybe deciding whether I was a threat that needed to be dealt with or just a temporary intrusion it could ignore. I called my family that day and told them I needed to move to a different location. I didn't explain exactly why, just said the Chehalis site was too isolated and I'd be more effective working from the Leavenworth location where our second campground was being developed. Leavenworth was different, more developed, closer to town, with better road access. I thought the change of location would end my encounters with whatever lived in those deep Washington forests. I was wrong. The Leavenworth site was in the mountains, surrounded by different terrain but equally dense forest. My trailer was positioned on a ridge overlooking the valley where the main campground would be built, and the nearest neighbor was still miles away. Within a week of moving to the new location, the footsteps started again. Same pattern, same bipedal gait, same systematic circling of my campsite. Whatever had been investigating me at Chehalis had either followed me to Leavenworth or I'd moved into territory occupied by something similar. The wood knocking resumed as well, but with a different rhythm. Instead of the 3-2-3 pattern I'd heard at Chehalis, this was more like 5 quick knocks followed by a long pause, like a different individual with its own communication style. 3 weeks into my stay at Leavenworth, I had my second clear sighting. This time, I was driving back to my trailer late one evening after a long day coordinating with contractors in town. The dirt road that led to my campsite wound through thick forest for about 2 miles, and I'd driven it dozens of times without incident. I was maybe half a mile from my trailer when something large stepped out of the forest directly in front of my truck. I hit the brakes and came to a stop maybe 20 feet from the creature. It was similar to what I'd seen at Chehalis, but not identical. This one seemed slightly smaller, maybe 7 feet tall instead of 7.5, but with the same basic body structure. Dark fur, powerful build, long arms, large head. It stood in the middle of the road, looking directly at my headlights without any apparent fear. For maybe 30 seconds, we stared at each other. The creature showed no inclination to move out of the road, and I was too shocked to do anything but sit there with my foot on the brake. Then, without any warning, it simply stepped to the side and disappeared into the forest. Just like at Chehalis, the departure was casual and unhurried. Like the creature had satisfied its curiosity about my truck and decided to let me pass. I drove the rest of the way to my trailer in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure nothing was following me. That encounter convinced me that I wasn't dealing with isolated incidents. There was something living in these forests that was intelligent enough to track human activity, curious enough to investigate our presence, and confident enough to confront us directly when it chose to. I spent 6 more months living in various remote locations as we developed more Thousand Trails sites. Each location brought similar experiences: footsteps at night, wood knocking, systematic investigation of my campsite, occasional direct sightings. The encounters followed a consistent pattern. The creatures seemed more curious than aggressive, more interested in understanding what I was doing than in driving me away. But they also demonstrated a level of intelligence and organization that was deeply unsettling. Years later, when I was visiting a friend who lived near our original Chehalis site, I finally asked him if he'd ever seen anything unusual in those forests. My friend had lived in the area his whole life, was known for being honest and practical, not the type to make up stories for attention. His response still gives me chills. He told me that once, while driving home late at night, he'd seen one sitting in the drainage ditch beside the road, just sitting there, watching cars go by like it was observing human behavior. When it saw his headlights approaching, it had stood up and calmly walked away into the forest. The description he gave me matched exactly what I'd encountered during my months in those remote trailers. Same height, same build, same intelligent behavior, same casual confidence in the presence of humans. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected for decades, that the Pacific Northwest forests harbor something that most people never see, something that's learned to coexist with human development while maintaining its own hidden existence. I'm in my 70s now, and the Thousand Trails network has grown into a major business with campgrounds across the country. But I've never forgotten those months I spent alone in the Washington wilderness, living just yards away from something that most people believe is mythical. The footsteps circling my trailer in the darkness, the wood knocking echoing through the forest. The massive figure stepping into my headlights, studying me with obvious intelligence before casually walking away. Those experiences changed how I think about wilderness, about the things that live in places humans rarely visit, about the intelligence that might exist in forms we don't recognize or understand. And sometimes, when I'm staying at one of our more remote campgrounds, I still listen for those familiar sounds in the darkness, still wonder if something might be out there in the trees, watching our campers with the same curiosity it once showed toward a young man living alone in a trailer 50 years ago. The forest keeps its secrets, but occasionally it lets some of us catch a glimpse of what those secrets might be. Story 9. I've told pieces of this story to a few people over the years, but I've never told the whole thing from start to finish. What happened to me and my 4 friends on Memalu Road in the mid-90s still doesn't make complete sense, even now, decades later. But I know what I experienced that night, and I know it changed all of us in ways we didn't fully understand until much later. This was back in the mid-90s, when we were all in our early 20s and thought we were invincible. You know how it is at that age. You take risks without really thinking about consequences. You go places you probably shouldn't go, and you assume everything will work out fine because it always has before. The 5 of us had decided to drive up Memalu Road on a Friday night. It's one of those winding mountain roads in Oregon that stretches for miles through dense forest. The kind of place that looks beautiful during the day, but feels completely different after dark. We'd heard it was scenic, and we figured it would be a fun way to spend an evening, just driving around, maybe finding a good spot to hang out and drink a few beers. We took 2 cars because we couldn't all fit in one vehicle. My friend was driving the lead car with 2 other guys, and I was in the second car with the 4th member of our group. The plan was simple: drive up the mountain, see what was up there, and then head back down before it got too late. The guy in the lead car was one of those drivers who thought he was better than he actually was. He'd taken racing classes, knew all about performance driving, and never missed a chance to show off his skills, which meant he was driving way too fast for the conditions, especially on a narrow mountain road he'd never been on before. The road started out normal enough, paved 2-lane highway winding through the foothills. But as we climbed higher, it turned into gravel, then into something that was barely more than a dirt track. The kind of road that's fine if you take your time, but dangerous if you're trying to keep up with someone who's driving like he's on a racetrack. We were maybe 10 miles up the mountain when disaster struck. I was following the lead car around a sharp curve when I saw brake lights and then saw them disappear completely. By the time I came around the curve, I could see what had happened. The lead car had gone off the road and rolled into the ditch. I stopped immediately and ran over to check on everyone. The car was on its side, pretty badly damaged, but thank God nobody was seriously hurt. A few scrapes and bruises, some shaken nerves, but nothing that required immediate medical attention. The car, on the other hand, was completely destroyed. No way it was driving anywhere ever again. So now we had 5 people, 1 working vehicle, and we were miles from civilization on a mountain road that most people probably didn't even know existed. The smart thing would have been to all pile into my car and drive back down to get help. But we were young and stupid, and 3 of the guys from the wrecked car decided they'd rather walk down the mountain than be crammed into my small car with all of us. I tried to talk them out of it. The road was rough, it was getting dark, and we were a long way from anywhere. But they insisted they'd be fine, said they'd rather stretch their legs and walk than be uncomfortable in an overcrowded car. So we agreed to meet them at the bottom of the mountain. That was our first mistake. My passenger and I got back in our car and started driving down the mountain. But we'd only gone maybe 2 miles when one of the guys who'd chosen to walk started completely freaking out. He was running alongside our car, pounding on the windows, screaming for us to stop. When we pulled over, he was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool mountain air. His eyes were wide with panic, and he kept looking back up the road like he expected something to come charging out of the darkness after him. "There's something in the bushes," he said, his voice shaking. "Something following us. It's been keeping pace with us since we left the crash site." I looked back up the road, but couldn't see anything unusual. Just dark forest on both sides, thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet into it, even with our headlights. But this guy was genuinely terrified, more scared than I'd ever seen him. "What kind of something?" my passenger asked. "I don't know," he said, "but it's big, and it's been moving through the trees right next to us. Every time we stop, it stops. When we start walking again, it starts moving again." The other 2 guys caught up with us a few minutes later. They looked spooked too, constantly glancing over their shoulders at the forest around us. When we asked them about what our friend had said, they confirmed that they'd all heard something moving through the trees parallel to the road. "Heavy footsteps," one of them said, "like someone big walking through the forest but trying to stay out of sight." "And breaking branches," the other added. "Whatever it is, it's not worried about making noise, just staying hidden." Now I was starting to get nervous. These weren't guys who spooked easily. They'd all grown up in Oregon, spent plenty of time in the mountains, knew what normal forest sounds were like. If they said something was following them, I believed them. That's when our friend started yelling at whatever was in the forest. Just started screaming at the top of his lungs, telling whatever was out there to show itself, to stop hiding and come out where we could see it. He was angry now instead of scared, which somehow made the whole situation even more unsettling. We all stood there listening, but I couldn't hear anything unusual. Just the normal night sounds of wind in the trees and maybe some small animals moving around in the underbrush. But the 3 guys who'd been walking were all staring at the same spot in the forest, like they could see or hear something I couldn't. "It's still there," one of them whispered. "Right there, maybe 20 yards in, just watching us." I strained to see what they were looking at, but the forest was too dark and too thick. If something was out there, it was well hidden. But the fear in their voices was real, and their body language suggested they were looking at something specific, not just being paranoid about random forest sounds. That's when we heard our other friends coming down the road. The 2 guys we'd left at the top of the mountain were running down the hill, shouting for us to get in the car immediately. When they reached us, they were both out of breath and obviously panicked. "We need to leave right now," one of them said. "There are lights in the forest." "What kind of lights?" I asked. "Moving lights, like someone with a flashlight or a headlamp, but moving through the trees in patterns that don't make sense. They were circling our position up at the crash site, getting closer and closer." The other guy nodded frantically. "We tried calling out, thinking maybe it was another hiker or someone coming to help. But the lights just kept moving, never responded to us, and they were too high up. Like whoever was carrying them was walking 8 or 10 feet off the ground." Now everyone was thoroughly spooked. We had 5 guys who'd all experienced something strange and threatening in different parts of the same forest. Whatever was out there had apparently been tracking our movements from multiple positions, watching us from hidden locations throughout our time on that mountain. "We're getting out of here," I said. "Everyone in the car, now." It was a tight fit with 5 people in a car designed for 4, but nobody complained. We just wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was lurking in those woods. I started the engine and began driving down the mountain as fast as I dared on the rough road. But we'd only gone maybe half a mile when something happened that I still can't fully explain. The forest around us suddenly lit up with dozens of moving lights, like a whole group of people with flashlights had surrounded us and were moving through the trees on both sides of the road. The lights weren't random or chaotic. They moved in coordinated patterns, like whoever was controlling them was communicating with each other. Some would move forward while others held position. Some would move higher up the slope while others stayed low. It looked organized, purposeful, and they were definitely following us. As we drove down the mountain, the lights kept pace with our car, staying just inside the tree line where we could see them but couldn't make out who or what was carrying them. Sometimes they'd disappear for a few seconds, then reappear further ahead, like they were leapfrogging positions to maintain surveillance on our movement. Everyone in the car was silent, just watching these lights move through the forest around us. I was concentrating on driving, trying not to hit any rocks or holes in the rough road, but I kept glancing to the sides to track the lights' movement. They seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance, close enough to keep us in sight, but far enough away that we couldn't see details about who or what was carrying them. The really unsettling part was how high some of the lights were positioned. I'm talking about lights that seemed to be 8, 9, maybe 10 feet off the ground, moving smoothly through terrain that would be difficult for a normal person to navigate even in daylight. Whatever was carrying those lights was either incredibly tall or was somehow moving through the forest canopy. After maybe 10 minutes of this escort, the lights began to fade away. Not all at once, but gradually, like whoever was controlling them had decided we were far enough down the mountain that we were no longer a concern. By the time we reached the paved road at the bottom, they were completely gone. We drove the rest of the way back to town in stunned silence. Nobody wanted to be the first to try to explain what we'd just experienced. When we finally did start talking about it, we all had slightly different versions of what we'd seen and heard. The guys who'd walked down first insisted that something large had been following them through the forest, keeping pace with their movement, but staying out of sight. They'd all heard heavy footsteps and breaking branches, and they were convinced that whatever was tracking them was bigger than a normal person. The 2 guys who'd stayed at the crash site longer described the lights as being carried by figures that moved through the forest with impossible ease, navigating rough terrain in complete darkness without any difficulty. They'd watched these figures position themselves in a loose circle around the crash site before beginning to move down the mountain. And all of us in the car had seen those coordinated lights moving through the forest, tracking our movement down the mountain road with an organization that suggested intelligence and planning. Over the years, I've read about other people having similar experiences in remote forest areas. Stories about lights moving through trees in coordinated patterns, about being followed or escorted by unseen figures, about encounters with things that seem to demonstrate both intelligence and a desire to remain hidden. The connection between lights and Bigfoot sightings comes up a lot in these stories. I don't know what to make of that connection, but I know what I saw that night on Memaloo Road. We were being watched, followed, and possibly escorted by something that operated with organization and intelligence. Whatever was in those forests wasn't random wildlife. The coordinated movement of the lights, the systematic way they'd positioned themselves around our group, the apparent communication between multiple individuals, all of that suggested a level of planning and cooperation that you wouldn't expect from animals. The experience changed how I think about remote wilderness areas. When I'm in deep forest now, especially at night, I'm aware that I might not be alone, that there might be things watching from the shadows, things that are intelligent enough to stay hidden, but confident enough to make their presence known when they choose to. None of us went back to Memaloo Road. We never even discussed the possibility. Whatever was up there had made it clear that we weren't welcome, and we were smart enough to take the hint. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we'd tried to make contact with whatever was watching us. Would they have revealed themselves? Would they have communicated with us in some way? Or would the encounter have taken a much darker turn? The lights moving through those trees that night were real. The coordination and intelligence behind their movement was undeniable. Something lives in those deep Oregon forests, something that most people never encounter but that occasionally chooses to make contact with humans who wander into areas they probably shouldn't be exploring. And after what I experienced that night, I'm not sure I want to know exactly what that something is. Story 10. I was in 7th grade when this happened, maybe 12 or 13 years old, and I'm in my 40s now. But I remember every single detail of what we experienced near Morristown, Michigan, like it happened yesterday. Some things are just burned into your memory so deep that time doesn't fade them at all. What my family went through that year changed all of us, and we've never talked about it publicly until now. My brother had just finished building his house on 10 acres of property outside Morristown. It was a beautiful piece of land. Open field in the front where you could see for maybe half a mile, and the back half was heavily wooded with old growth trees that stretched for miles into state forest land. The kind of place that feels peaceful and isolated, where you can actually see the stars at night and hear the wind moving through the trees. We moved in during the summer, and at first everything seemed perfect. My brother had done most of the construction work himself, and he was proud of what he'd accomplished. The house was solid, well built, positioned to take advantage of the views across the field while still being sheltered by the tree line. But as the nights got longer and the weather turned colder, we started hearing things that didn't belong in that peaceful setting. It began with wood knocking, not the random sounds of branches hitting each other in the wind, but deliberate, rhythmic knocking that sounded like someone was using a piece of wood as a hammer against tree trunks. The sounds would start around 10 or 11 at night and continue for hours, always coming from deep in the forest behind our house. At first, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a woodpecker working late, or branches settling as the temperature dropped. But the sounds were too regular, too purposeful. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 5 knocks. Always different patterns, like someone was trying to communicate using a code we didn't understand. Along with the wood knocking, we started hearing howls, not the familiar sound of coyotes or wolves, which we knew from camping trips. These were deeper, more powerful, with a quality that seemed almost human, but not quite right. They'd echo across the field and through the forest, lasting maybe 10 or 15 seconds before fading into silence. The howls were unsettling in a way I can't properly describe. They had an emotional quality that suggested intelligence and intent. Sometimes they sounded mournful, like something calling for a lost companion. Other times they sounded aggressive, like warnings directed at anyone who might be listening. My dad was getting frustrated with the constant noise. He worked early shifts and needed his sleep, but the sounds from the forest were keeping him awake night after night. After maybe 2 weeks of this, he decided to call the county sheriff's department to report the disturbances. The deputy who answered the phone was polite, but clearly skeptical. Probably figured we were city people who weren't used to normal forest sounds and were overreacting to ordinary wildlife behavior. But my dad insisted that something unusual was happening on our property, and the deputy promised to send someone out to take a look. A couple of nights later, the sounds were particularly loud and persistent. The wood knocking seemed closer than usual, maybe only a few hundred yards into the forest instead of the usual half-mile or more. The howls were more frequent too, coming from multiple directions, like there was more than one thing out there communicating with each other. My dad had had enough. After lying in bed listening to the racket for about an hour, he got up and went downstairs to look out the windows facing the field. He wanted to see if he could spot whatever was making all the noise. What he saw made his blood run cold. There was a massive black figure moving across our field, maybe 200 yards from the house. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but it was too big to be human. Way too big. My dad estimated it was at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any person should have. The figure was moving deliberately across the open ground, not trying to hide or stay out of sight. It seemed to be heading toward the dirt road that ran past our property, taking long, measured strides that covered ground faster than a normal person could walk. Dad watched it for maybe 2 minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. The figure never looked toward the house, never changed its pace, just continued its steady march across our field until it disappeared into the darkness near the road. The next morning, Dad called the sheriff's department again. This time he was more specific about what he'd witnessed, describing the size and behavior of whatever had been on our property. The deputy he spoke with seemed more interested than the first one had been, and promised to send someone out to investigate. Around 10 in the morning, a patrol car pulled into our driveway. The deputy was a middle-aged guy who'd probably been working in the area for years, the kind of cop who's seen everything and doesn't spook easily. Dad showed him where he'd seen the figure crossing the field and described its size and movement pattern. The deputy walked out to the dirt road to look for tracks or other evidence. He was out there for maybe 20 minutes, examining the area where the figure would have crossed from our field onto the road surface. When he came back to talk to Dad, his whole demeanor had changed. He looked nervous, maybe even scared. Gone was the professional calm he'd shown when he first arrived. He told Dad he'd found some tracks, but he didn't want to discuss what he'd seen. Instead, he got in his patrol car and drove away fast, kicking up gravel as he accelerated down our driveway. Dad said the deputy's tires were actually squealing as he left, like he couldn't get away from our property fast enough. Whatever he'd found out there on the road had spooked him badly enough that he abandoned his investigation and fled. We didn't hear anything from the sheriff's department for the rest of the day. No follow-up call, no report, no explanation of what the deputy had discovered. It was like they wanted to pretend the whole incident had never happened. But around 4 in the afternoon, we saw 3 military trucks coming down our dirt road. Not National Guard vehicles, not local law enforcement. These were serious military trucks, the kind with canvas covers and camouflage paint that you see in war movies. They drove past our house and continued down the road toward where the deputy had been investigating that morning. Right behind the military convoy came 2 sheriff's department patrol cars. They set up a roadblock, preventing anyone from driving down the dirt road past a certain point. We could see the deputies setting up barriers and redirecting the few local residents who tried to use the road. My dad walked out to talk to the deputies, but they wouldn't give him any information. Just said there was some kind of training exercise happening and civilians needed to stay away from the area for their own safety. When Dad pressed them for details, they became evasive and told him to go back to his house. About an hour after the military trucks had passed, we heard gunfire. Not hunting rifles or pistols, but automatic weapons fire. the rapid, sustained bursts you associate with military combat. It was coming from the direction the trucks had gone, maybe half a mile down the road from our house. The shooting went on for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, hundreds of rounds being fired in controlled bursts, like soldiers engaging multiple targets. Then sudden silence that seemed to echo across the landscape. My dad, my brother and I all stood in our yard, listening to that gunfire and trying to understand what was happening. We'd called the sheriff to report strange sounds and a large figure crossing our field. Now there were military vehicles and automatic weapons fire on our quiet country road. The military trucks came back about 45 minutes later, driving slowly and deliberately. We couldn't see much detail through their canvas covers, but they seemed to be carrying cargo that hadn't been there when they'd first arrived. Bulky shapes that could have been equipment or supplies or something else entirely. After the trucks passed, the sheriff's deputies packed up their roadblock and left without stopping to explain what had happened. Within an hour, our dirt road was back to normal, like nothing unusual had occurred. But that evening, one of the original deputies came back to our house. The same guy who'd investigated the tracks that morning and then left in such a hurry. He looked tired and stressed, like he'd been through something that had shaken him badly. When my dad asked what had happened with the military exercise, the deputy's response was brief and obviously scripted. Training maneuvers, he said, routine operations that local law enforcement had been asked to support, nothing that should concern us. But when Dad pressed him about what he'd found in the road that morning, the deputy's facade cracked slightly. He told Dad that what he'd discovered was consistent with what you reported seeing. Then he added something that still gives me chills, but now it's been dealt with. The deputy left without providing any additional details, and we never heard from the sheriff's department about the incident again. As far as they were concerned, the case was closed. The sounds from the forest stopped completely after that day. No more wood knocking, no more howls, no more anything unusual. The woods behind our house became as quiet and peaceful as you'd expect a normal forest to be. But the silence was almost as unsettling as the sounds had been. It felt like something that had been living in those woods for years, maybe decades, had suddenly been removed. The ecosystem felt empty, incomplete. My dad never saw another large figure crossing our field. We never heard those haunting howls echoing through the trees. Whatever had been sharing our property with us was gone, and the way it had been removed suggested that the authorities knew exactly what they were dealing with. Over the years, I've tried to research what might have happened that day. I've looked for records of military training exercises in our area, reports of unusual wildlife incidents, anything that might explain the sequence of events we witnessed. I've never found anything. No official records, no newspaper coverage, no acknowledgement that anything unusual happened near Morristown that day. It's like the whole incident was scrubbed from the record books, but I know what I experienced. I heard those inhuman howls night after night. I saw my father's reaction when he described the massive figure crossing our field. I witnessed the deputy's terror when he came back from examining the road. I heard automatic weapons fire in an area where no military training should have been taking place. Most importantly, I remember the sudden, complete silence that followed. The way the forest behind our house went from being alive with mysterious sounds to being as quiet as a cemetery. Whatever was living in those woods had been intelligent enough to avoid detection for years, powerful enough to terrify experienced law enforcement officers, and significant enough that the military was called in to deal with it. The deputy's phrase keeps echoing in my memory. Now it's been dealt with. Not captured, not relocated, not studied, dealt with, like it was a problem that required a permanent solution. I'm middle-aged now, with kids of my own, and I still think about what happened on that 10-acre property near I think about the howls that seemed to carry emotions I couldn't understand. I think about the massive figure my father saw crossing the field with such purposeful determination. I think about the fear in that deputy's eyes when he came back from the road. Most of all, I think about the automatic weapons fire and the sudden permanent silence that followed. We moved away from that property a few years later. My brother said it was for better job opportunities, but I think we all knew the real reason. The place felt different after that day, empty in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. Sometimes I wonder if there were others like whatever lived in our woods. If there are still places where ancient things hide from human civilization, waiting to be discovered by families who build homes too close to their territory. And sometimes I wonder what would happen if another family moved to a similar property and started hearing similar sounds in the night. Whether the same response would be triggered, the same military intervention, the same permanent silence. The woods are full of secrets, and some of those secrets are apparently too dangerous to be allowed to exist. Story 11. I've never been able to fully explain what happened to me on the Upper Royal Basin Trail in August of 1983. Even now, over 40 years later, I get anxious just thinking about it. What I saw in those Washington mountains challenged everything I thought I knew about what exists in our world, and the memory of it still gives me nightmares. My husband and I had driven up to Washington for his cousin's wedding. It was our first time in the Pacific Northwest, and after the ceremony, we decided to spend a few extra days exploring the area before flying back home. We'd heard that the Olympic Peninsula had some incredible hiking trails, and the Upper Royal Basin Trail had been recommended to us as a moderate day hike with beautiful alpine scenery. We started early that morning, maybe around 7:30, wanting to get a good start before the day got too warm. The trailhead was easy enough to find, and the first few miles were exactly what we'd hoped for. Well-maintained trail winding through old-growth forest, with glimpses of mountain peaks through the canopy. But from the moment we started hiking, I felt uneasy. It wasn't anything I could put my finger at first, just a vague sense that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet, maybe, or the shadows felt deeper than they should have been. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that something was following us, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. My husband didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He was in a great mood, excited about the scenery and the chance to do some fishing in the mountain lakes we were supposed to encounter further up the trail. I tried to shake off my nervousness and focus on enjoying our hike, but the feeling of being watched only got stronger as we climbed higher. We'd hiked maybe 4 miles when my husband decided he wanted to try his luck at one of the small lakes we'd passed. He'd brought his fishing gear, and the water looked perfect for trout. I wasn't much of a fisher myself, so I found a large boulder near the shoreline where I could sit and read while he worked the water. The boulder was maybe 10 feet across and relatively flat on top, perfect for stretching out with a book and enjoying the mountain air. I'd brought a paperback novel to keep me occupied, and I settled in for what I expected to be a peaceful hour or two while my husband tried to catch our dinner. But the anxiety I'd been feeling all morning only got worse once we stopped moving. Sitting still made me hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the forest around us. I kept looking up from my book to scan the tree line, convinced that something was watching us from the shadows. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't concentrate on reading. Every few minutes, I'd put the book down and study the forest, trying to identify what was making me so nervous. But everything looked normal, just dense woodland stretching up the mountainside, thick with ferns and fallen logs. My husband was about 50 yards away, working his way around the edge of the lake with his fly rod. He seemed completely relaxed, focused on his fishing, and oblivious to my growing unease. I envied his ability to just enjoy the moment, without the constant feeling that we were being observed. I'd been sitting on that boulder for maybe 30 minutes when something made me look up from my book again. This time, when I scanned the tree line, I saw movement about 100 yards away, up the slope from where we were positioned. At first, I thought it was a bear. The shape was large and dark, and it was moving through the forest with the kind of deliberate, unhurried pace you'd expect from a big animal. My first instinct was to call out to my husband and warn him, but something made me hesitate and take a closer look. That's when I realized what I was seeing wasn't a bear at all. The creature emerged from the thick forest and moved into a small clearing where I could see it more clearly. It was walking upright on two legs, with a gait that was almost human but not quite right. Too fluid, too powerful for a person. And it was massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The entire body was covered in thick reddish-brown hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair that looked coarse and wild, hanging in patches over what appeared to be incredibly muscled limbs. The arms were disproportionately long, reaching almost to the knees as it walked, but what really made my blood freeze was the way it moved. This wasn't some confused animal that had learned to walk upright. This thing moved with purpose and intelligence, like it knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing. The head swiveled back and forth as it walked, scanning the forest around it with obvious awareness. I sat completely motionless on my boulder, afraid that any movement would attract its attention. The creature was moving parallel to the lake, following what might have been a game trail through the trees. If it continued on its current path, it would pass maybe 70 yards from where my husband was fishing. The thing that struck me most was how silent it was. Something that large should have been crashing through the underbrush, breaking branches and making noise with every step. But it moved through the forest like a ghost, placing each foot carefully and avoiding obstacles with an ease that seemed impossible for something of its size. As it moved along the tree line, I got a better look at its physical structure. The shoulders were incredibly broad, giving it a triangular silhouette that tapered down to a relatively narrow waist. The legs were thick and powerful, built for covering rough terrain without difficulty. The head was the most disturbing part. It was larger than a human head should be, with a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a flattened nose. Even from a distance, I could see that the facial features were more human-like than ape-like, but scaled up to proportions that shouldn't exist. The creature paused at one point, standing perfectly still near a cluster of tall firs. For maybe 10 seconds, it just stood there, and I had the terrifying thought that it might be looking at me. The distance was too great for me to make out its eyes clearly, but its head seemed to be turned in my direction. Then, without any warning, it simply melted back into the forest. 1 second, it was standing there in the clearing, clearly visible against the green backdrop of the trees. The next second, it was gone, vanished into the shadows as if it had never existed at all. I sat on that boulder for another few minutes, heart pounding, staring at the spot where I'd last seen it. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the stress of being in unfamiliar wilderness had made me hallucinate something that wasn't there. But I knew what I'd seen. The details were too clear, too specific to be a product of imagination. The reddish-brown hair, the powerful build, the intelligent way it had moved through the forest, all of it was burned into my memory with perfect clarity. When my husband finally came back from his fishing expedition, maybe 30 minutes later, I was still shaken. He could tell something was wrong just by looking at my face, and when he asked what had happened, I tried to explain what I'd witnessed. I saw something, I told him, something big, walking upright through the trees. It wasn't a bear, and it definitely wasn't human. He looked skeptical, which I couldn't blame him for. If someone had told me the same story a few hours earlier, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear standing up to get a better look around?" he asked. "They do that sometimes." I shook my head. It was walking, not just standing. And it was too big, too coordinated. This thing moved like it was designed to walk on 2 legs. My husband looked up at the tree line where I'd seen the creature, but of course there was nothing visible now. just peaceful forest and mountain scenery. "Maybe we should head back," he said, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Not concern that we were in danger, but concern that the isolation and altitude were affecting my judgment. I didn't argue. The last thing I wanted was to spend more time in those woods, especially with something that large and unknown, potentially still in the area. We packed up our gear and started hiking back toward the trailhead immediately. The hike down was tense for me. Every shadow could be hiding the creature I'd seen. Every sound from the forest could be footsteps paralleling our movement. I kept looking back over my shoulder, convinced that we were being followed, but I never saw anything unusual. My husband tried to make conversation, probably hoping to distract me from whatever had spooked me so badly. But I couldn't shake the image of that massive figure moving through the forest with such silent confidence. When we finally reached the parking area and got back to our rental car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But even as we drove away from the trailhead, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something large step out of the forest behind us. Over the years, I've read about other people having similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Stories about large, hair-covered creatures walking upright through remote wilderness areas. The descriptions are always remarkably consistent. The size, the reddish-brown hair, the intelligent movement patterns. What I saw on the Upper Royal Basin Trail matched those descriptions perfectly. The creature I witnessed wasn't some misidentified bear or trick of light and shadow. It was something that shouldn't exist, according to conventional understanding, but which was as real as the boulder I'd been sitting on. The encounter changed how I think about wilderness areas. When I'm hiking now, especially in remote locations, I'm aware that I might not be alone, that there might be things living in deep forests that most people never see, things that are intelligent enough to avoid human contact, but occasionally reveal themselves to hikers who happen to be in the right place at the right time. I've never been back to the Olympic Peninsula. My husband and I have done plenty of hiking in other areas over the years, but something about those Washington mountains holds no appeal for me anymore. Too many shadows, too many places where something large could be watching without being seen. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the creature had noticed me sitting on that boulder. Would it have approached? Would it have tried to communicate in some way? Or would it have simply disappeared back into the forest, leaving me to question whether I'd really seen anything at all? The fact that it seemed to be avoiding contact suggests an intelligence that understood the implications of being seen by humans. It had chosen to reveal itself, either accidentally or intentionally, and then had chosen to vanish before the encounter could develop further. What still haunts me is how effortlessly it moved through terrain that would be challenging for an experienced hiker. How something that massive could navigate thick forest without making a sound. How it could appear and disappear at will, like it had complete mastery over its environment. That creature belonged in those mountains in a way that I never could. It was perfectly adapted to the terrain, perfectly camouflaged, perfectly equipped to exist in a world that most humans never see. And for just a few seconds on that August morning in 1983, it allowed me to glimpse that hidden world. The memory of those 20 seconds has stayed with me for over 40 years. The reddish-brown hair gleaming in the mountain sunlight, the powerful stride that covered ground with impossible ease, the intelligence evident in every movement. I know how it sounds. I know most people would dismiss it as imagination or misidentification, but I also know what I saw in those Washington mountains, and I know it was real. Something lives in those deep forests, something ancient and powerful and intelligent, something that chooses when and if to make contact with the human world, and on one perfect August morning, it chose to let me see it. Story 12. I was 9 years old in 1981 when this happened, living in Saginaw, Michigan, right on the edge of town, where our neighborhood butted up against a golf course and miles of wooded areas. I'm in my 50s now, but I can still remember every detail of that night like it happened yesterday. What I saw from our living room window changed everything I thought I knew about what exists in this world. Our house was positioned perfectly for a kid like me who loved to look out at the world. We lived on the very edge of the city limits, where the suburban streets gave way to open space and forest. From our front windows, you could see across a field to my elementary school, and between our house and the school was this intersection with a street light that illuminated everything in a wide circle. I was always a night owl, even as a little kid. My parents would put me to bed at a reasonable hour, but I'd lie there wide awake, too wired to sleep. On this particular night, it was around 1 in the morning and I still wasn't tired, so I snuck out of my bedroom and went to the living room to look out the windows. I'd done this dozens of times before. There was something peaceful about the neighborhood at night, the way everything looked different in the darkness. I'd watch for cars passing by, or sometimes see a deer wandering through the field, or just enjoy the quiet emptiness of the sleeping world around me. I was standing on the back of our sofa, pressing my face against the cool window glass, when I saw something moving near the streetlight at the intersection. At first, I thought it was just another person walking home late, maybe someone who'd been out drinking or working a late shift. But as I watched, I realized something was off about the figure. It was too big, too hairy. What I'd initially taken for a person with long hair was actually something covered head to toe in thick, dark fur. The creature was walking upright on 2 legs, moving slowly and deliberately through the circle of light cast by the streetlight. It wasn't hurrying or trying to stay hidden, just walking with purpose, like it had every right to be there in the middle of our suburban neighborhood. My first thought was that it looked like Chewbacca from Star Wars. I'd seen that movie a few years earlier, and the size and hairiness of this thing reminded me of that character. But this was real, walking down the street outside my house, not some costume in a science fiction movie. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, giving it a triangular silhouette that tapered down to a narrower waist. The arms were long and powerful, swinging slightly as it walked. The whole body was covered in thick, dark hair that looked coarse and wild. What really got my attention was how it moved. This wasn't some person in a costume stumbling around trying to see through eye holes. It moved with natural coordination and balance, like walking upright was the most normal thing in the world for it to do. The creature entered the intersection from the direction of the golf course and wooded areas, walked straight through the circle of light, and continued toward the subdivision on the other side. It never paused, never looked around, never showed any sign that it was concerned about being seen. Just a casual stroll through our neighborhood in the middle of the night. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds total before it disappeared into the shadows beyond the streetlight. Even after it was gone, I stayed pressed against the window, straining to see if it would reappear or if there were others following behind it. But the intersection returned to its normal emptiness, and I was left wondering if I'd really seen what I thought I'd seen. At 9 years old, my imagination was pretty active, and I'd been known to see things that weren't really there. Maybe this was just my tired brain playing tricks on me. I stayed at the window for another 10 or 15 minutes, hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever I'd witnessed. But nothing else unusual happened, and eventually I went back to bed, my mind racing with questions about what I'd seen. The next morning, I told my mum about the hairy man I'd watched walking through the intersection. She listened patiently to my description, but I could see the skepticism in her expression. When I finished my story, she gave me that look parents give their kids when they're trying to be understanding about an obvious fantasy. "Honey, you were probably dreaming," she said gently. "Sometimes when we're half asleep, we can think we see things that aren't really there." I tried to convince her that I'd been wide awake, that what I'd seen was real and detailed and impossible to mistake for a dream. But the more I insisted, the more she seemed convinced that I'd either been dreaming or had let my imagination run wild while looking out the window in the dark. It was probably just someone walking their dog, she suggested. In the dark, with the streetlight creating shadows, it might have looked like something it wasn't. But I knew what I'd seen wasn't a person with a dog. The proportions were all wrong. The movement was too fluid, and there had been no sign of a leash or a separate animal. This was one creature, walking alone, covered in hair from head to toe. After breakfast, I put on my winter coat and boots and headed outside to investigate. If what I'd seen was real, there might be some evidence left behind. Footprints in the snow, maybe, or some other sign that something large had passed through our neighborhood. The intersection was maybe 2 blocks from our house, an easy walk across the field that separated our street from my school. The snow from the previous week was still on the ground, packed down on the sidewalks, but still soft and deep in the areas where people didn't usually walk. When I got to the intersection, I started looking around for any sign of what I'd witnessed the night before. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the normal mix of footprints from people walking to and from the bus stop, tire tracks from cars, the usual debris you'd expect to find at a suburban intersection. But then, at the edge of the circle of light cast by the streetlight, I found something that made my heart race. There in the snow was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was huge, at least twice as long as my own foot and much wider. The print showed clear toe impressions, 5 toes like a human foot, but the proportions were completely wrong. The footprint was deep, pressed into the snow with the weight of something incredibly heavy, and it was barefoot. No boot sole pattern, no shoe tread, just the impression of a massive, naked foot walking through our Michigan winter without any protection from the cold. I knelt down beside the print, placing my own boot next to it for comparison. My size 4 snow boot looked like a child's shoe next to this massive impression. Whatever had made this track had feet that were easily 14 or 15 inches long and maybe 6 inches wide. Following the path of the footprints, I could trace the route the creature had taken through the intersection. The prints came from the direction of the wooded area, just as I'd observed from my window, crossed through the intersection, and continued toward the subdivision, where they eventually faded on the plowed pavement. But there was one print that was clearer than all the others, right at the edge of a small snowbank, where the creature had apparently stepped down from the curb. This print showed incredible detail, the individual toe impressions, the arch of the foot, even what looked like texture from thick, rough skin. I stared at that footprint for several minutes, trying to process what it meant. This was physical proof that what I'd seen from my bedroom window was real. Something large and unknown had walked through our neighborhood, leaving evidence that couldn't be explained away as imagination or dreams. When I got back home and told my mom about the footprint, she was skeptical but curious enough to come outside and take a look for herself. I led her back to the intersection, excited to show her the proof that would validate my story from the night before. The footprint was still there, clear as day in the snow. My mum knelt down beside it, studying the size and depth of the impression with obvious surprise. "Well, that's certainly a big footprint," she admitted, "but it could be from someone wearing very large boots. Maybe someone was playing a prank, or..." She trailed off, studying the toe impressions that were clearly visible in the snow. No boot would leave marks like that. This was definitely a barefoot print, and no human would be walking barefoot through snow in Michigan in the middle of winter. My mom took some pictures of the footprint with her camera, but I could tell she was struggling to come up with a rational explanation for what we were looking at. The evidence was undeniable, but it pointed to something that shouldn't exist, according to everything we understood about the world. Over the next few days, I went back to check on the footprint several times. New snow eventually covered it up, but for almost a week, it remained visible as proof of my encounter. I brought a few of my friends to see it, and their reactions ranged from amazement to skepticism to outright disbelief. But the footprint was there, and no amount of skepticism could make it disappear. The experience changed me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Before that night, I'd been a pretty fearless kid, comfortable playing outside after dark, unafraid of shadows and strange sounds. But after seeing that creature walk through our intersection like it owned the place, I developed a healthy respect for the unknown. I started paying more attention to the wooded areas around our neighborhood, wondering what else might be living there that we didn't know about. I'd lie in bed at night, listening for sounds that didn't belong, watching the streetlight outside my window for any sign of movement. The creature never came back, at least not that I saw. But knowing it had been there once, knowing it was comfortable enough to walk openly through our suburban streets, made me realize that there might be things in this world that most people never encounter. As I got older, I learned about other people who'd had similar experiences. Stories from all over the country of large, hairy creatures walking upright, leaving massive footprints, appearing briefly before disappearing back into wilderness areas. The descriptions were always remarkably consistent. The size, the hair, the human-like but not quite human appearance. What I saw that night in Saginaw matched those descriptions perfectly. The creature that walked through our intersection wasn't some misidentified animal or trick of light and shadow. It was something that shouldn't exist, according to conventional understanding, but which was as real as the footprint it left in the snow. I'm middle-aged now, with kids of my own, and I still think about that night sometimes. I wonder where that creature came from, where it was going, what it was doing in our suburban neighborhood. I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, still walking through the darkness while most people sleep. Most of all, I wonder how many other 9-year-olds have looked out their bedroom windows at just the right moment to see something that would change their understanding of the world forever. The footprint in the snow was proof that what I witnessed was real. But even without that physical evidence, the memory of watching that massive hairy figure walk calmly through the streetlight like it belonged there would have stayed with me for the rest of my life. Some things you see can't be unseen, can't be rationalized away, can't be dismissed as imagination or dreams. What I witnessed that winter night in 1981 was one of those things. And sometimes, when I'm driving through suburban neighborhoods late at night, I find myself watching the streetlights and intersections, wondering if something might step out of the shadows and remind me that there are still mysteries in this world, still things we don't understand walking among us in the darkness. The creature I saw that night was real, the footprint it left was real, and somewhere out there, it might still be walking through quiet neighborhoods, letting the occasional insomniac child catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist, but absolutely does. Story 13. I've never told this story to many people because I know how it sounds. What happened to me in the fall of 2018 near Franklin, Pennsylvania still doesn't make sense to me, even now. I keep going over it in my head, trying to find some rational explanation for what I witnessed, but I always come back to the same impossible conclusion. I saw something that shouldn't exist. I was driving home from work on a Thursday evening, taking my usual route through some of the more remote areas outside Franklin. It's mostly farmland and forest out there, with long stretches of winding roads that cut through thick woods. I'd driven that route hundreds of times before. It's actually a few miles longer than taking the main highways, but it's peaceful and I enjoy the scenery. It was early evening, maybe around 6:30, and the sun was starting to get low in the sky. Fall in Pennsylvania can be beautiful, with all the leaves changing colors, and I was taking my time, not in any hurry to get home. The road I was on runs through this large wooded area that stretches for miles in all directions. The kind of deep forest where you can drive for 20 minutes without seeing a single house or building. I was maybe halfway through this wooded section when something burst out of the tree line ahead of me. At first I thought it might be a deer. They're always darting across roads in that area, especially around dusk. But as my brain processed what I was seeing, I realized this was something completely different. The thing that came out of the forest was moving on all fours, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. It was too big, too fast, and its movements were wrong somehow. It crossed the road maybe 50 yards ahead of me, and I hit the brakes instinctively, even though I wasn't in any danger of hitting it. But here's where it gets really weird. Halfway across the road, this thing stood up, just rose up on its hind legs like it was the most natural thing in the world. And when it stood up, I got my first clear look at what I was dealing with. This was not a normal animal, not even close. Standing upright, the creature was maybe 7 feet tall, possibly taller. It was covered in hair, but not thick fur like a bear. This was more sparse, patchy hair that let me see the outline of its body underneath. And what I could see of that body was disturbing as hell. The thing was emaciated. I could make out the shape of its rib cage through the thin covering of hair, like it was starving or sick. Its limbs were incredibly long and thin, especially the arms, which hung down past what would be knee level on a human. The proportions were all wrong, like someone had taken a person and stretched them out in all the wrong directions. But the head was the worst part. It was definitely canine-shaped, like a dog or wolf, but scaled up to impossible size. The snout was long and narrow, and even from the distance I was at, I could see that it was mostly hairless compared to the rest of the body. The skull looked too big for the neck that was supporting it. What really freaked me out were the eyes. Even in the fading daylight, I could see these deep, hollow sockets where its eyes should be. Not just dark eyes, actual hollows, like empty cavities in its skull. It was like looking at a living skeleton with some meat and hair still clinging to the bones. The creature paused right there in the middle of the road, standing on its hind legs, and turned to look directly at me. For maybe 3 or 4 seconds, we stared at each other through my windshield. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing dropped back down to all fours and bounded into the forest on the other side of the road. But the way it moved, Jesus, the way it moved. It didn't run like a normal animal. It moved with this fluid, almost liquid motion that covered ground way faster than anything that size should be able to move. I sat in my stopped car for maybe 2 minutes, engine running, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of my brain was insisting that I'd seen a deer or a bear or some other normal woodland animal, and the poor lighting had made it look like something else. But I knew that wasn't true. What I'd seen was too specific, too detailed to be a trick of light or perspective. When I finally worked up the nerve to drive past the spot where it had crossed, I slowed way down and looked for any evidence of what had happened. The road surface was too hard to show tracks, but I could see where something had disturbed the grass and underbrush on both sides of the road. I made it home that night, but I couldn't shake the image of that thing standing in the road, looking at me with those hollow eye sockets. I didn't tell my wife about it right away. I needed time to think about what I'd experienced, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The next day at work, I was still pretty shaken up. I must have looked like hell, because one of my co-workers asked if I was feeling okay. Without really thinking about it, I ended up describing what I'd seen the night before. That's when things got really interesting. My co-worker listened to my whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, she got this look on her face that I'll never forget. It was like recognition mixed with fear. "You saw a skinwalker," she said quietly. I'd never heard the term before, so I asked her what she meant. That's when she told me about her own experience from when she was a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She'd been visiting relatives on a reservation out west, and one night she saw something that matched my description almost exactly. Tall, emaciated, moving between 4 legs and 2 legs, with that distinctive canine head and hollow eye sockets. Her grandmother had told her it was a skinwalker, some kind of shapeshifter from Native American folklore. The similarities between what she described and what I'd witnessed were too close to be coincidence. Same basic body structure, same disturbing thinness, same hollow eyes, same fluid movement between 2 legs and 4. She'd seen her creature during the day, which had given her even more detail than I'd been able to make out in the evening light. But here's what really got to me. She said that seeing a skinwalker was supposed to be a sign of bad luck, or that something terrible was going to happen. Her grandmother had been genuinely frightened when she told her about her encounter and had spent days performing some kind of cleansing rituals to protect their family. I tried to dismiss this as superstition, but I couldn't get it out of my head. What if what I'd seen wasn't just some unknown animal, but something much worse? What if it was some kind of predator that specifically targeted humans? Over the next few weeks, I found myself taking different routes home from work. I avoided that wooded section of road completely, even though it meant adding 15 or 20 minutes to my commute. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't bring myself to drive past that spot again. I also started researching skinwalker stories online, and what I found was deeply unsettling. There were dozens of accounts from people who'd had encounters similar to mine. The descriptions were remarkably consistent: tall, thin creatures that could move on 2 legs or 4, canine features, hollow or sunken eyes, and an overall appearance of something that was starving or diseased. Many of the stories came from the southwestern United States, particularly areas near Native American reservations. But there were reports from all over the country, including several from Pennsylvania. People described encountering these things on remote roads, in deep forests, near abandoned buildings. What disturbed me most were the accounts that described the creature's behavior. Unlike normal animals, which typically avoid human contact, these things seemed to be curious about people. They'd follow cars, observe houses from the tree line, sometimes even approach campsites or rural homes. And in several stories, the encounters had been followed by a string of bad luck or traumatic events in the witnesses' lives. People reported deaths in their families, serious accidents, financial disasters, all occurring within weeks or months of their skinwalker encounters. I tried to tell myself this was just people looking for patterns where none existed, finding connections between unrelated events. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing problems in my own life. First, my wife got sick. Nothing life-threatening, but a persistent illness that the doctors couldn't diagnose or treat effectively. Then I had a minor car accident that totaled my vehicle and left me with some nagging back problems. A few weeks later, we discovered that our basement had been slowly flooding for months, causing thousands of dollars in damage that our insurance wouldn't cover. Each event by itself could be explained as normal bad luck, the kind of random problems that everyone deals with. But the cluster of issues, all happening in the months following my encounter, started to feel like more than coincidence. I found myself thinking about that creature more and more, the way it had looked directly at me, the intelligence I'd sensed in that brief moment of eye contact. What if it hadn't just been crossing the road when I happened to drive by? What if it had been waiting for me specifically? The thought was paranoid and irrational, but I couldn't shake it. Something about that encounter had felt deliberate, planned, like I'd been selected for observation by something that understood far more about the world than I did. I never saw the creature again, despite driving through that area occasionally over the following months. But I developed a persistent feeling of being watched, especially when I was alone at night. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision or hear sounds outside my house that didn't match any normal nighttime activity. My wife started commenting on how jumpy I'd become, how I'd react to normal household sounds like someone was breaking in. I couldn't explain to her that I felt like something was keeping track of me, monitoring my activities from a distance. The strangest part was how the memory of the encounter remained so vivid. Usually, traumatic or unusual experiences fade over time, becoming less clear as months pass. But my recollection of that creature standing in the road, looking at me with those hollow eyes, stayed as sharp and detailed as if it had happened yesterday. I could still see every detail, the way its rib cage showed through the sparse hair, the unnatural length of its limbs, the size and shape of that canine head. Most disturbing of all, I could still feel the intelligence behind those empty eye sockets, the sense that it was studying me with the same intensity that I was studying it. What I saw on that road near Franklin wasn't a bear or a deer or any known animal. It wasn't a person in a costume or a trick of light and shadow. It was something that shouldn't exist, according to everything we're taught about the natural world, but which was as real as the steering wheel I was gripping when I saw it. The encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds total, but it changed my understanding of what might be sharing this world with us. There are things in the deep forests and remote areas that most people never see, things that are intelligent enough to avoid human contact most of the time, but occasionally choose to reveal themselves. Why that creature chose to show itself to me, I'll never know. Maybe it was just chance. I happened to be driving past at the moment it decided to cross the road. Or maybe there was something more deliberate about the encounter, some reason I was selected to witness something that most people never see. All I know for certain is that what I saw that evening was real. The emaciated body, the hollow eyes, the fluid movement between 2 legs and 4, the obvious intelligence in the way it observed me. All of it burned into my memory with perfect clarity. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my house, I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, still moving through the dark forests, still choosing which humans to reveal itself to, still watching from the shadows with those terrible, empty eyes. The skinwalker I encountered on that Pennsylvania road was real, and the fact that I may never understand what it was or why it showed itself to me is something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. Story 14. I've never talked about this publicly before, and I probably never should. What I'm about to tell you violates multiple military regulations and could probably land me in serious legal trouble even now, decades later, but I can't keep this to myself anymore. What I witnessed at Fort Lewis in 1996 changed everything I thought I knew about what our government knows and what they're willing to do to keep certain secrets. I was serving as a team leader in the OP-4, Opposition Force, during a major training exercise. For those who don't know military terminology, OP-4 units play the role of enemy forces during training scenarios, helping regular units practice combat tactics in realistic conditions. It was demanding work, but I was good at it, and I took pride in making the training as challenging and educational as possible for the troops we were working with. The exercise was taking place in one of the more remote areas of Fort Lewis, deep in the Washington wilderness that stretches for miles around the base. We'd been out there for 3 days, running scenarios with different units, living rough in the field like we would during actual combat operations. On the 3rd night, my team had set up our position on top of a wooded hill that gave us a commanding view of the valley below. It was a perfect tactical position. We could observe enemy movement, coordinate our response, and retreat quickly if we got overwhelmed. The kind of spot that wins exercises if you use it right. We'd settled in for the night around 10 o'clock, rotating guard duty while the rest of the team got some rest. The forest was quiet, except for the usual night sounds. Insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional owl calling in the distance. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested we were about to witness something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Around midnight, we were jolted awake by the sound of gunfire coming from the valley below us. But this wasn't the blank ammunition we used for training exercises. I'd been in the military long enough to know the difference between blanks and live rounds, and what we were hearing was definitely real ammunition being fired at real targets. The sound was coming from maybe 300 to 400 meters away, down in the thick forest that filled the valley. Automatic weapons fire, M16S or similar rifles, being fired in controlled bursts like soldiers engaging enemy targets. But there wasn't supposed to be any live fire exercise happening in our area that night. My first thought was that somebody had screwed up the scheduling, that we'd been positioned too close to a live fire range. But I knew the fort well enough to know there weren't any ranges in that part of the wilderness. Whatever was happening down there wasn't on any official training schedule. The gunfire continued for maybe 30 seconds, sustained bursts with brief pauses, like a firefight between multiple combatants. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. But the silence that followed was broken by something that made my blood freeze. A roar. Not a human sound, not any animal sound I'd ever heard, but something in between. It was deep, powerful, and filled with what sounded like pain and rage. The sound was so loud we could feel it vibrating through the ground, like it was coming from something with the lung capacity of a whale. The roar went on for maybe 10 seconds, echoing off the hills and seeming to come from everywhere at once. Then silence again, complete, dead silence that felt unnatural after what we'd just heard. My team was fully alert now, everyone trying to figure out what the hell was happening in the valley below us. We had night vision equipment, but the forest was too thick for us to see through to where the gunfire had come from. All we could do was listen and wait. That's when we heard vehicles approaching. Not the Humvees or trucks we used for training exercises, but heavier vehicles moving through the forest with the sound of diesel engines and track systems. Something like Bradley fighting vehicles, or maybe even tanks. The vehicles stopped somewhere in the valley, and we could hear voices shouting orders. Too far away to make out specific words, but the tone was urgent, military, like soldiers dealing with a serious situation that required immediate action. We stayed in position, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was clearly some kind of military operation, but it wasn't part of our exercise, and it wasn't anything we'd been briefed about. The use of live ammunition in a training area was especially concerning. After about 20 minutes, we heard the vehicles moving again, this time heading in our direction. I made the decision to have my team pack up and move to a different position. Whatever was happening, I didn't want us to get caught in the middle of it. But we were too late. We just started gathering our equipment when powerful flashlights lit us up from multiple directions. Within seconds, we were surrounded by soldiers in full combat gear, weapons trained on us, orders being shouted for us to drop our weapons and get on the ground. These weren't regular army troops. Their gear was different, newer, more advanced than what we typically saw at Fort Lewis. No unit patches or name tapes, just black uniforms with minimal markings. They moved and operated like special operations forces, highly trained and completely professional. The squad leader approached us once we were secured. He was a big guy, maybe in his 30s, with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of combat experience. When he spoke, his voice was level and controlled. "You're going to come with us," he said. "Don't ask questions. Don't talk unless you're asked a direct question. What you're about to see is classified beyond your clearance level." We were loaded into armored personnel carriers and driven deeper into the forest. The vehicles had to navigate rough terrain, pushing through areas where there weren't any established roads. After maybe 10 minutes, we stopped in a clearing that had been set up as some kind of field command post. There were multiple vehicles parked around the perimeter, APCS, communications trucks, what looked like a mobile laboratory unit. Portable lighting had been set up, illuminating the entire area with harsh white light, and everywhere soldiers in the same black uniforms, all carrying weapons and moving with the efficiency of a unit that had done this kind of operation before. But what dominated the center of the clearing was something I still have trouble believing I saw. 2 bodies. Massive bodies covered in dark hair, lying motionless on the ground. Even from a distance, I could see that they were much larger than human, with proportions that didn't match any known animal. The bodies were positioned so that the smaller one, though still enormous, was lying next to the larger one. As we were escorted closer, the details became clear and horrifying. These were Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. These were the creatures that most people think are myths or hoaxes, but here they were, real as the ground I was standing on, and they were dead. The larger one was clearly male, maybe 9 feet tall and built like a powerlifter, scaled up to impossible proportions. The body was riddled with bullet holes, dark blood staining the thick hair that covered him from head to toe. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the forest canopy above. The smaller one was female, and she was still alive. Barely. She was maybe 8 feet tall, less bulky than the male, but still incredibly powerful looking. Her breathing was labored, and she was coughing up blood with each breath. But what made the scene even more heartbreaking was the obvious intelligence in her eyes, and the tears, actual tears, running down her face as she died. This wasn't some animal expiring from its injuries. This was a being that understood what was happening to her, that was grieving for her dead companion, that was aware enough to be afraid of the soldiers standing around her with weapons. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of blood, wet fur, and something wild and musky that I'd never encountered before. It was the smell of something that belonged in deep wilderness, far from human contact. I watched in horror as the female's breathing became more and more labored. Her eyes would focus on different soldiers around the perimeter, and I swear I could see intelligence there, awareness, even what looked like reproach. Like she understood that we were responsible for what had happened to her and her mate. The whole scene lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then her breathing stopped, and both creatures were dead. That's when things moved very quickly. We were loaded back into the APCS and driven to a different location, what looked like a temporary detention facility set up in an abandoned building. There we were met by a full colonel who clearly outranked everyone else on site. The colonel was older, maybe in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire career dealing with classified operations. When he spoke to us, his message was clear and terrifying. He told us that what we had witnessed was a matter of national security, classified at levels that could result in decades of imprisonment if we ever discussed it with anyone. He explained that there were things in the world that the general public wasn't ready to know about, and that our job as soldiers was to protect that ignorance. We were given direct orders under the Uniform Code of Military Justice never to speak about what we had seen. The colonel made it clear that violating these orders wouldn't just result in court-martial, it would result in us disappearing into the federal prison system for the rest of our lives. Each of us was required to sign multiple documents acknowledging our understanding of the classification level and the consequences of disclosure. We were told that our military records would be flagged and that any attempt to discuss the incident would be detected and prosecuted to the fullest extent of military law. The threats weren't subtle or implied. They were direct and specific. We were told exactly what would happen to us, our families, our futures, if we ever broke our silence about what we had witnessed in that forest clearing. After the briefing, we were returned to our regular training exercise as if nothing had happened. The official record showed that we had completed our OP4 mission successfully and that there had been no unusual incidents during the exercise. But 3 days later, we were called back to the same area to continue our training rotation. I was curious to see if there would be any evidence left of what we had witnessed, any sign that the incredible scene in the forest clearing had actually happened. The clearing was completely clean. No blood, no evidence of the vehicles, No indication that dozens of soldiers had been operating in that area just days before. Even the vegetation that had been trampled by all the military activity had been restored or replaced. It was like the whole incident had been erased from reality. The efficiency of the cleanup operation was almost as disturbing as the original incident. Whatever organization had been responsible for the operation had the resources and capability to completely eliminate all traces of their activities in a matter of days. Over the following weeks and months, I tried to research what we might have stumbled into. I looked for any official acknowledgement of special operations in our area, any reports of unusual military activity, anything that might shed light on what we had witnessed. I found nothing. No records, no reports, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred at Fort Lewis during our training exercise. It was like the entire incident had been classified out of existence. The other members of my team never spoke about what we had seen, even among ourselves. The colonel's threats had been effective, and we all understood that our careers and our freedom depended on maintaining absolute silence about the incident. But I never forgot what I saw in that forest clearing. The intelligence in the female's eyes as she died, the obvious grief she showed for her dead mate, the human-like tears running down her face. These weren't just unknown animals. They were beings with emotions, relationships, awareness of their own mortality, and our government had killed them. Deliberately, systematically, with automatic weapons and special operations forces. Then they had covered up the entire incident so thoroughly that it might as well have never happened. I've been out of the military for decades now, but I still think about those creatures sometimes. I wonder how many others like them are living in remote wilderness areas. How many times similar incidents have occurred? How many soldiers have been sworn to secrecy about things the public is never supposed to know? Most of all, I think about the tears on that female's face as she died, and the intelligence in her eyes that was so obviously human-like. Whatever those creatures were, they didn't deserve to die like that. And the world deserves to know that they existed, even if acknowledging that fact means admitting some uncomfortable truths about what our government is willing to do to keep certain secrets. I know the risks of telling this story. I know what could happen to me for violating orders that are probably still in effect. But I can't take this secret to my grave. Some things are too important to keep hidden forever, no matter what the personal cost might be. What I saw at Fort Lewis in 1996 was real. The creatures were real, their deaths were real, and the cover-up was real. And somewhere in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, there might be others like them, living in fear of the day when black-clad soldiers with automatic weapons come for them too. Story 15. I'm shaking as I write this, and I know how crazy it's going to sound. What happened to me in September of 2012 on 8th Avenue East in Spanaway still doesn't feel real, even though I lived through every second of it. I've replayed that night in my head thousands of times, and I always come to the same impossible conclusion. I saw the Patterson film come to life right in front of my headlights. I'd just finished a late shopping trip at the Walmart in Spanaway. Nothing unusual about that. I work irregular hours, and sometimes I end up running errands at weird times when the stores are less crowded. It was maybe 10:30 at night, and I was driving home along my usual route through some of the more rural areas outside town. 8th Avenue East is one of those long, straight roads that cuts through farm country and patches of forest. During the day, it's peaceful and scenic, but at night it becomes something completely different. Dark, isolated, with thick woods on both sides and very little traffic. The kind of road where you can drive for miles without seeing another car. That night was particularly dark. No moon, heavy cloud cover, and my right headlight had burned out a few days earlier. I'd been meaning to get it fixed, but work had been busy and I kept putting it off. So I was driving with just one working headlight, which meant I had to keep my high beams on to see the road properly. Under normal circumstances, driving with one headlight on a dark country road would make me nervous. But I'd driven that route hundreds of times over the years, and I knew every curve and landmark. I was taking my time, being extra careful, but I wasn't particularly worried about the drive home. That changed in an instant. I was maybe halfway down 8th Avenue East when my single headlight illuminated something that made me slam on the brakes so hard my seatbelt cut into my chest. About 400 feet ahead of me, crossing the road from left to right, was a figure that looked exactly like the creature from the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. If you've never seen that footage, it shows a large, hairy, bipedal creature walking across a clearing in Northern California back in 1967. The creature moves with this distinctive gait. Long, powerful strides, arms swinging, looking back over its shoulder at the camera. It's been analyzed by scientists for decades, with some claiming it's genuine and others insisting it's a hoax. What I saw crossing 8th Avenue East was identical to that footage in every detail. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, possibly 8. It was covered head to toe in dark hair or fur that looked coarse and thick. The build was incredibly powerful, with broad shoulders, long arms, and legs that looked like tree trunks. But what really got my attention was how it moved. This thing didn't walk like a person in a costume. It moved with natural coordination and balance, taking these enormous strides that covered ground faster than any human could manage. Each step seemed effortless, like walking upright was the most natural thing in the world for it. But here's the detail that made my blood freeze. Halfway through crossing the road, the creature stopped and looked back at me over its right shoulder, just like in the Patterson film. The head turned, the body paused mid-stride, and for maybe 2 seconds, it stared directly at my headlight. Even from 400 feet away, I could sense intelligence in that look. This wasn't some confused animal that had wandered onto the road. This was something that understood it was being observed and was making a conscious decision about how to respond. Then it simply continued walking, disappearing into the forest on the right side of the road like it had never been there at all. I sat in my stopped car for maybe 5 minutes, engine running, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My first instinct was to explain it away. Maybe it was a person in a dark coat, and the poor lighting had made them look larger than they actually were. Maybe it was a bear that had reared up on its hind legs for a few seconds, but I knew that wasn't true. What I'd seen was too specific, too detailed to be a case of mistaken identity. The size, the proportions, the way it moved, the intelligence in that backward glance, all of it pointed to something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about the world. When you see something that doesn't fit into your normal understanding of reality, your brain tries to file it away in some other category. It looks for explanations that make sense, alternatives that don't require you to completely reassess what's possible. I went through all of those mental gymnastics as I sat on that dark road. Maybe it was a person playing a prank, someone who knew that road was isolated and wanted to scare drivers. Maybe it was some kind of promotional stunt, a viral marketing campaign that I'd accidentally stumbled into. But even as I ran through these possibilities, I knew they didn't hold up. The creature I'd seen was too large, too convincing, moved too naturally to be any kind of costume or special effect. And the location was too random, too isolated for any kind of organized hoax. Finally, I worked up the courage to drive to where the creature had crossed. I slowed way down and examined both sides of the road, looking for any evidence of what I'd witnessed. The pavement was too hard to show footprints, but I could see where something had disturbed the tall grass and weeds on both sides of the road. On the left side, where the creature had emerged, there was a clear path through the vegetation leading back into the woods. On the right side, where it had disappeared, the grass was flattened in a line heading toward the tree line. Something large had definitely passed through this area, and recently. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the road ahead for any sign of movement. The rational part of my brain was still insisting that I'd seen something ordinary, that the darkness had made look extraordinary. But deep down, I knew I'd witnessed something incredible. The next day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. The image of that creature crossing the road kept playing in my head like a video loop. The powerful stride, the backward glance, the casual way it had walked from forest to forest, like it owned the whole area. At work, I must have looked pretty shaken up because several of my co-workers asked if I was feeling okay. Without really thinking about it, I ended up describing what I'd seen the night before. That's when things got really interesting. The first person I told just looked at me like I was crazy, which I'd expected. But when I mentioned it to a few other co-workers, I got some surprising responses. 3 different people told me they'd had similar encounters in the same general area. One guy said his girlfriend had seen something matching my description walking along the tree line near her house, which was less than a mile from where I'd had my encounter. She'd been looking out her bedroom window late at night when she saw this massive, hairy figure moving through the field behind her house. Another co-worker told me his father had been riding his Harley-Davidson through that area a few months earlier when something large had crossed the road in his headlight beam. He described it as the biggest, hairiest person he'd ever seen, walking upright, but way too big to be human. The third person had heard similar stories from other people in the area, but hadn't had a direct encounter himself. He said there'd been rumors for years about something unusual living in the forests around Spanaway, but most people just dismissed them as local folklore. What struck me about these stories was how consistent they were with what I'd experienced. Same general location, same basic description, same sense that whatever people were seeing was intelligent and aware of human presence. I started researching Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest, and what I found was both fascinating and disturbing. Washington State has more reported Bigfoot encounters than anywhere else in the country, with hundreds of sightings documented over the past several decades. Many of the reports came from areas very similar to where I'd had my encounter, rural roads cutting through dense forest, usually during evening or nighttime hours. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Large, hair-covered bipedal creatures moving with intelligence and purpose through areas where humans rarely venture. What really got my attention were the accounts that mentioned the creatures' behavior when they encountered humans. In many cases, the witnesses described the same thing I'd experienced, a moment of mutual observation where the creature would pause and look directly at the human before continuing on its way. This wasn't the behavior you'd expect from a wild animal, which would typically either flee immediately or show signs of aggression. These creatures seemed to be making conscious decisions about how to respond to human presence, evaluating the situation before choosing their next move. Reading through dozens of similar accounts, I started to understand that what I'd experienced wasn't unique or isolated. There were things living in the forests of the Pacific Northwest that most people never see, but which occasionally reveal themselves to drivers on remote roads or hikers in deep wilderness. The more I learned, the more I realized how profoundly the encounter had affected me. I found myself taking different routes home from work, avoiding 8th Avenue East, even though it was the most direct path. When I did drive through rural areas at night, I was hyper-aware of every shadow, every movement in my peripheral vision. It's strange how seeing something that's supposed to be impossible changes your relationship with the world around you. Before that night, I'd thought I understood what was real and what wasn't, what existed and what belonged in the realm of myth and legend. Now I knew there were things walking around that challenged everything I'd been taught about the natural world, things that were intelligent, aware, and choosing when and how to interact with human civilization. The encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds total, but it fundamentally changed how I think about wilderness areas, about the things that might be watching from the shadows, about the possibility that there are forms of intelligence in this world that we don't recognize or understand. I can see how someone might keep an encounter like this to themselves for their entire life. The experience is so outside normal reality that sharing it feels like admitting to a delusion or a breakdown. People look at you differently when you tell them you've seen something that's not supposed to exist. But I know what I saw on 8th Avenue East that September night in 2012. I saw something that matched every detail of the most famous cryptid footage ever recorded, something that moved with natural grace and intelligence through an environment where it clearly belonged. The creature crossing that road wasn't lost or confused. It wasn't accidentally revealing itself to human observation. It was simply going about its business in a world that most of us never see, occasionally crossing paths with humans who happen to be in the right place at the right time to witness something extraordinary. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten out of my car, if I'd tried to approach the area where the creature had crossed. Would I have found footprints? Would there have been other evidence of its presence? Or would it have been watching me from the forest, deciding whether this particular human posed a threat that needed to be dealt with? The fact that my headlight had burned out might have saved me from making a very dangerous decision. If I'd had full visibility that night, if I'd been able to see the creature more clearly, I might have been tempted to investigate further, and something tells me that would have been a mistake. What I encountered that night was real, intelligent, and perfectly adapted to an environment that I was just passing through. It allowed me to see it, perhaps by accident or perhaps by choice, and then disappeared back into a world that exists parallel to our own, but rarely intersects with it. The image of that creature looking back over its shoulder is burned into my memory as clearly as if I'd taken a photograph. The intelligence in that glance, the casual confidence in its movement, the sense that I was being evaluated by something that understood far more about the world than I did. I'll never forget that moment of mutual recognition on a dark road in Spanaway, when two very different forms of intelligence briefly acknowledged each other's existence before going their separate ways into the night. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone on remote roads after dark, I still find myself watching for shadows that move with too much purpose, for figures that are too large and too coordinated to be human, for that distinctive backward glance that says you've been seen by something that was never supposed to exist.